Chapter 438. The Wang family of Beihai could stand at the peak of martial arts for hundreds of years because they had the 6 paths of reincarnation, which was known as the ultimate outbreak of the world. In the days when the Li family had not fallen from the altar, it was also recognized by the world as the best in kendo because the last 3 ultimate swords of the 24 moves of sword was unparalleled. Azura Path had been glorious. In terms of time, Azura Path existed in Zhongzhou state even before Mount Shu. At the peak of Azura Path, their master had also been at the top of the divine list and stood beside several experts at the peak of the invincible realm without being at a disadvantage. That was a long time ago. That amazing figure had completely perfected the martial arts of Azura Path and pushed Azura Path to the peak of the dark world when he was alive. Every martial arts force, more or less, sooner or later, must have its own essence as long as it could be inherited. The essence of Azura Path was only one move. Daoist madness. Now the essence of this move was not in the hands of Azura Path. It was in the hands of Hua Qingfeng, the master of the Shadow Sect. Now it was in the hands of Li Tianlan. To some extent, Daoist madness was worthy of its name. This unique skill was completely strange and domineering. The extremely strange way of exerting force and the absolutely violent way of accumulating force finally resulted in the madness and domineeringness of losing all reason. Martial arts madness exerted force at the end of the spine. This move had existed for hundreds of years, and there was still no unique skill in the dark world that first exerted force here. Exerting force from the end of the spine and connecting the upper and lower limbs, the violent accumulation of force at that moment not only brought absolute power, but also pain that was enough to drown all reason. This way of exerting force brought almost permanent damage to the spine. Not only did it burn one's potential, but it was also cruelly destroying one's own body. Before hurting the enemy, he hurt himself first. The craziest and most tragic unique skill. But it was enough to make Li Tianlan completely burst out incredible combat capability in an instant. Dual wind and thunder veins were almost half destroyed in today's battle. But even if they were really half destroyed, Li Tianlan still had wind and thunder veins. The moment his spine tightened, his limbs were directly stretched to the limit in the process of blood burning wildly. Li Tianlan's eyes had no luster except for the scarlet killing intent. The boundless pain almost ignored all of his willpower and completely drowned his reason in an instant. The world seemed to have disappeared. All the sounds were getting further and further away. There were only flowing sounds in Li Tianlan's ears. It was neither gentle nor slow, but extremely violent, like boiling magma surging violently. It was the sound of his blood burning. At this moment, Li Tianlan had lost his mind. However, his body was exceptionally awake. Black Ghost was particularly clear in his eyes, and vaguely seemed to have become his only goal. All of his judgments were unprecedentedly swift and clear. This is not the judgment of the brain. It was instinct. It was the most terrifying, most natural and most ferocious instinct. This kind of reaction speed had almost surpassed everything else. And all the attacks, dodging, advancing and retreating made by such extreme reaction speed had another famous name in the dark world. Night walking. It was the strongest body movement recorded in the invincible manual of the catalogue of God of War of the Li family and the Lin clan. Li Tianlan gave up reason and relied on instinct. In a battle where he didn't need to consider other factors, this was almost his most perfect state at present. His taut bones continued to crackle, sounding like a dragon's roar. Martial Dao Berserk, Night Walking, Dragon Fist. Close combat, burning his potential in exchange for great combat power, the fastest reaction speed, the most ferocious attacks. In this state, Li Tianlan was completely fearless. Every cell in his body seemed to be roaring to support his craziest fight. Black Ghost kept retreating in his sight. The dark knife light merged with the night. The sound of the wind became violent in an instant. The figures of Li Tianlan and Black Ghost drew closer again at the moment when they were pulled apart. The knife light slashed on Li Tianlan. The broken clothes of cloud silk became more and more damaged. The moment the blood splashed, Li Tianlan, who had entered the best attack distance, became completely violent. Fire appeared in Black Ghost's pupils. There was thunder. The orange and blue colors flickered for a moment. The next second, the flames and thunder all turned into a strange pale white. The turbulent energy did not spread, but condensed to the limit, turning into extremely pale and demonic white spots. The white spots seemed to be suddenly pressed down before they were completely formed. Violent wind and rainstorm. In an instant, Black Ghost's eyes were full of attacks. In the dragon's roar, which was not grand but almost deafening, Li Tianlan's body had completely become a phantom that could not be captured by the naked eye. His body was there, but he was moving. Straight punch, uppercut, elbow strike, knee hit, leg sweep, roundhouse. Fast. In addition to the speed, Black Ghost only felt the extreme power. Retreat. Black Ghost could only retreat. His defense was extremely poor. Under such power he could hardly bear any of Li Tianlan's attacks. And Li Tianlan in this state, Black Ghost believed that he could not bear any of his attacks either. But the problem was that Black Ghost had no chance to attack at all. Li Tianlan gave up all his defenses in exchange for the most violent attack. In this state, Li Tianlan also had no defense. Both of them had no defense. One of them attacked wildly. One of them dodged. This was a real life and death fight. Both of them were looking for opportunities. The moment the stalemate was broken, it must be a clear life and death. Jiang Qiansong stared at the battle between Li Tianlan and Black Ghost. His heart kept sinking. He had never thought that Li Tianlan, who was seriously injured to this extent, could still have enough combat power to suppress Black Ghost in an instant. Li Tianlan was not Black Ghost's opponent. The current suppression could only be described as a stalemate. But no matter how strong Black Ghost was on paper, in a real battle his lack of defense would become a great variable. What Jiang Qiansong hated most was variables. The Zhang family of South America lost Zhang Xianxia 3 years ago. Today they lost Zhang Qianyan again. In any case, Black Ghost must be alive. Otherwise, how could the Zhang family of South America, supported by him alone, expand in the future? And the death of Black Ghost meant that the layout of the Zhang family of South America in Eastern Europe had completely failed. All the current situations would be completely changed. Such a change, in addition to making Li Tianlan rise completely in the Dark World, was also an absolute disaster for the Zhang family of South America. Jiang Qiansong took a step back subconsciously. In the current situation he no longer thought about how to win, but had begun to think about how to retreat with Black Ghost. His footsteps just moved. An indescribable sense of oppression had come from all directions. Black Ghost completely disappeared in front of him. There was only light in Jiang Qiansong's world. The light was continuous and filled the surroundings, like a wildfire burning the sky, like a thunder that could destroy the world. The 100 elites of Xianyuan sword troop were still silent. But at the same time they attacked with all their strength. 100 experts with average strength at the peak of the fire-flaming realm. Such a team meant that there were at least 30 thundershocking realm experts. 30. Only real behemoths like the Wang family of Beihai and the Lin clan could have such a scale of power. Qin Shilai's figure also disappeared in the dazzling light. But the sword light of Sharp Edge, which was famous in Eastern Europe, was surging. The dark sword master hid in the darkness again outside the light. His voice sounded in Jiang Qiansong's ear with killing intent. It was extremely clear. You will die today. Chapter 439. Everyone understood. From the moment Jiang Qiansong, the patriarch of the Jiang family of South America, and Black Ghost stood in the castle of Wuxia, the castle, known as the strongest war fortress in Eastern Europe, had been doomed. So Wuxia had already reached a consensus at the beginning of the battle. The castle was the foundation of Wuxia. But for the survival of the family, it was time to abandon the castle now. Tostel, who temporarily controlled Wuxia as a usurper, handed over the control of the castle and all system passwords to Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud of Sai City at the beginning of the war. This was a deal. Tostel handed over the complete control of the castle in exchange for the patriarch of Wuxia, his biological brother Schenker. In such a situation, such a deal, neither side felt that it was a loss. All the experts of the Wuxia family assisted Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud to start the weapon. But Tostel had already begun to transfer the important members of the Wuxia family at the beginning of the battle. 500 meters below the castle, there was an extremely well-hidden refuge. There was a secret passage in the refuge. Through the passage that cost a lot of money, a small number of important members of Wuxia could directly reach a small town less than 6 kilometers away from the castle. There were helicopters with special permissions in Wulan State parked in the small town. Taking the helicopter, they could reach all corners of Wuxia City in less than 20 minutes. This passage was very suitable for retreat. But in a way it was also very suitable for invasion. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud stayed in the control room of the castle. Cool Breeze stared at the battle in the castle, while Drifting Cloud stared at Tostel, who was retreating from the passage. The control room of the castle was very large. It looked extremely solemn on weekdays. But the battle between the experts of the Invincible Realm not only destroyed the front part of the huge castle, but also the main structure of the entire castle had been seriously damaged. At this moment the shrill alarm kept echoing in the control room. The big screen in the center reflected the battle in front of the castle, but more screens had been garbled, which meant that there were signals of failure or even complete damage in different areas of the castle. At present the castle is seriously damaged. Cool Breeze said in a calm tone. The third and fourth defense facilities have been completely destroyed and the fifth defense is out of order. It will take at least 8 hours to repair in this battle. He paused for a moment. In other words, in this battle this seemingly intimidating castle can't be counted on? Drifting Cloud shook his head. The strongest fortress in Eastern Europe, an ancient castle that can deter Invincible Realm experts. Is this what it looks like? Not everyone is Jiang Qiansong. Cool Breeze smiled bitterly. If it were an Invincible Realm expert tonight, even if the governor came in person, the laser and the destroyer in front would be enough to seriously injure the governor. Once this so-called fortress encountered a tortoise shell like Jiang Qiansong's, its role would indeed be reduced a lot. And tonight, before Qin Shilai came here, there were 3 Invincible Realm experts fighting. In such a battle, what can an ancient castle do? He took out a cigarette, lit it and suddenly said, "And what can we do here?" Lu Yun fell silent. They were top assassins in Zhengzhou state and even in the Dark World. Assassins didn't need to defend themselves. There was no clear division of professions in the Dark World, but different paths had different directions. An assassin was like a knife in the dark, killing without leaving a trace and killing with a single strike. However, in a battlefield where one had to face the enemy head-on, the role of an assassin was infinitely close to zero. Because they had no defense. Not to mention intervening in the battle of the Invincible Realm. Even on the battlefield where tens of thousands of elites fought, the living space of 1 or 2 assassins at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm would be greatly compressed. The current situation was already very clear. The ancient castle of Rekvia couldn't do anything. It was also useless for Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud to stay here. In a head-on confrontation, they couldn't even stop the moves of several Invincible Realm experts. Even if they found the best opportunity, they needed to fight for that possibility at the cost of their lives. Cool Breeze took a big drag on his cigarette and suddenly said, "It's almost time." The two of them knew very well that it was of little use to stay here. Li Tianlong naturally knew it. According to the plan, after the castle couldn't play a role, the two of them should follow the important members of Rekvia to Reki City as soon as possible. But the plan couldn't keep up with the changes. The planned castle couldn't play a role after all the energy was exhausted and all the weapons couldn't be used. Instead of being completely destroyed by the battle of several people. "It's time to go," Drifting Cloud said blandly. Cool Breeze raised his eyebrows. "Go." He glanced at the screen in the center of the control room. The screen was full of light. Hundreds of super elites of Xianyuan sword were advancing layer by layer. The sharp sword energy soared into the sky and tore the sky. On the battlefield between Li Tianlong and Black Ghost, the space was constantly twisting and exploding. Nothing could be seen. The situation was unclear. Were they leaving? "This is His Highness's order." Drifting Cloud looked down at the positioning device on his wrist. That was the tracker he left on Tostel. They have arrived at the refuge about 4 kilometers from the exit of the passage. Drifting Cloud's tone became calmer. "There's nothing for us to do here. We must enter Reki City at this time and prepare for His Highness's follow-up arrangements." Cool Breeze glanced at him and nodded. "Let's go." Drifting Cloud chuckled and finally glanced at the screen where the battle was extremely fierce. 26 people. I guess we have to act separately. Almost at the same time. A private helicopter entering from Snow Country slowly approached the sky over Reki City. Reki City, which was already in a state of martial law, reacted very quickly. As soon as the signal of the private helicopter was captured, the armed helicopter of Reki City's military had already rushed over fiercely. This is the airspace of Wulan State. You have entered the airspace under martial law. Please show me your identity. The majestic voice came out through the loudspeaker on the armed helicopter. However, before the military of Wulan state repeated it for the second time, a female voice had already sounded on the private helicopter without any weapons. It was a very authentic English pronunciation. The voice was very pleasant to hear, but it was extremely cold and indifferent. I'm King Tong. King Tong Irene Wang Rothschild. I'm entering Reki City now. Get out of the way. Clear, brief, straightforward, and domineering. King Tong. The Grand Duke of England. But everyone knew her other identity. The Queen of the Shadow Throne, who ranked 11th on the World Divine List. The military helicopter of Wulan State suddenly fell silent. The silence lasted no more than a minute. There seemed to be an urgent report on the helicopter. Then several helicopters turned in silence and flew to Reki City. The helicopter of the Queen of Shadows also flew to Reki City. The Queen sat in the cabin and looked at the armed helicopter that was getting farther and farther away. Her smile was a little cold. There was no doubt that the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance had made Rekvia, one of the 4 major families in Eastern Europe, completely out of control. Rekvia's loss of control also meant that Wulan state was out of control. In the surging general trend, the Jiang family of South America, Xianxia state and Rothschild were already involved. The only thing Wulan state could do at this time was to wait and see and wait for the final winner. The chaos in Eastern Europe stemmed from the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance. In the final analysis, it actually stemmed from the interest entanglement between the 4 major families. As one of the 4 major families, the Rekvia family lacked an invincible realm expert, so it naturally became the most important breakthrough point in the chaos in Eastern Europe. In the chaos in Eastern Europe, whoever could occupy Rekvia and Reki City would basically prove who would be invincible in Eastern Europe. King Tong stood up straight. The wind and rain over Reki City had stopped. The night was hazy and silent. It was an ordinary day. It was a turbulent day. From the perspective of later generations, this day was enough to be recorded in the history of all of Eastern Europe. Because in this chaos that was enough to affect the general trend in Eastern Europe for hundreds of years, this day was unanimously regarded as the beginning of the whole chaos by later generations. In the chaos before the arrival of the trial day, this day was called the Day of Death. Chapter 440. Killing intent was everywhere. There were battles everywhere. The entire Rekvia castle was constantly shaking in the fierce battle. Light and darkness. Domain and sword light. Thunder and raging fire. Fighting and blood. And order and chaos. Dark Swordmaster Qin Shilai was indeed no match for Jiang Qiansong in terms of hard strength. The first on the holy list could barely break Jiang Qiansong's defense. However, hundreds of super elites of Xianyuan sword supported him from all directions. The infinite thunderbolts and sword intent formed one complicated and changeable sword formation after another. Qin Shilai naturally became the center of the sword formation. He restrained most of Jiang Qiansong's attacks with his own strength. The attacks of hundreds of super elites roared in the night sky. This process was doomed to be dangerous, but it was the most formal way of fighting. It was formal and effective. The dense offensive like the waves and the sea held Jiang Qiansong in place. Jiang Qiansong still maintained his defensive domain. His face was a little pale. He was dealing with the attacks of Qin Shilai and hundreds of elites of Xianyuan sword with all his strength. He had no time to take care of Black Ghost. Black Ghost also did not have the mind to think about Jiang Qiansong's situation. Jiang Qiansong was fighting in a very formal way. But he was in complete chaos. Africa was chaotic. Black Ghost, who came out of the death training camp in Africa, could be said to be the king of chaos. But Black Ghost had never experienced such a battle. Madness, precision, swiftness, keenness, hysteria, desperation. In the case of one-on-one, Li Tianlan's sudden outbreak was completely with a spirit that completely ignored life and death. The illusory space continued to shatter and explode as Li Tianlan moved forward. Black Ghost tried his best to dodge and looked for opportunities to fight back. But all the counterattacks were suppressed. Li Tianlan, whose essence, qi and spirit were fully condensed, instinctively reacted faster than Black Ghost. Black Ghost's counterattack was getting less and less. Many times when his arm just moved before he had time to lift it, the roaring dragon fist with sword intent had completely blocked all his possible attack routes. As soon as his knife light was raised, Li Tianlan had already appeared one step ahead of him in the most inconvenient place for him to attack. In this state, Li Tianlan had completely become the most difficult opponent Black Ghost had encountered since his debut. He could see the limits of Li Tianlan's strength. After all, the combat power of the Invincible Realm was not the real Invincible Realm. The strength of Black Ghost was definitely above Li Tianlan. But the problem was that defense was his greatest weakness. If his defense was also at the level of the Invincible Realm, he could take 2 attacks from Li Tianlan at the risk of being seriously injured, and then kill Li Tianlan in this state in an instant. But with his current defense, Li Tianlan's first strike would probably make him lose most of his combat power. In the case of insufficient defense and completely suppressed reaction speed, Black Ghost's attack power was enough to be on the divine list, but he couldn't play any of it in Li Tianlan's crazy attack. This had nothing to do with the level of one's cultivation. In this state, Li Tianlan's fighting style completely suppressed the special Invincible Realm expert like Black Ghost, who had no power to fight back. Black Ghost kept retreating. Li Tianlan had gone completely mad. The two of them entangled and left the battlefield of Qin Shilai and Jiang Qiansong in the shortest time. Between the chase and the escape, Li Tianlan completely crushed Black Ghost and rushed into the cracked castle. The chaotic battle in the castle seemed to pause for a moment. Then there was a loud bang. A large area of the entire castle collapsed and stones fell. In the smoke and dust all over the sky, the remaining castle kept shaking. The crazy fighting did not stop, and it continued to spread in the castle farther and farther, as if to penetrate the entire castle. Jiang Qiansong's heart became more and more impatient. At this point he thought he had seen the situation clearly, although he didn't want to admit it. But for the Jiang family of South America, tonight was a failure. At least with Shenyuan's sword and Qin Shilai here, the possibility of him killing Li Tianlan was almost non-existent. It was also impossible for him to take down Wuxia tonight. In his perception, Black Ghost was getting farther and farther away from himself. The uneasiness in Jiang Qiansong's heart surged and grew stronger. His body suddenly retreated dozens of meters and took out a whistle from his pocket. Jiang Qiansong put the whistle to his mouth and blew hard. The extremely sharp whistle echoed between the mountains of the castle in an instant, bringing about layers of echoes. This was the whistle to summon Black Ghost. In other words, this was a signal to retreat. Although unwilling, at the critical moment when the balance of life and death gradually tilted, Jiang Qiansong could only admit his failure. After tonight, the situation of the Jiang family of South America was destined to be precarious. But it was not completely hopeless. What even Wuxia didn't know was that the Jiang family of South America had an extremely hidden base 100 kilometers away from Wuxia City. The elites of the Jiang family of South America were also hidden there. As long as Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost arrived there, even if they failed tonight, the Jiang family of South America could still save a chance to turn the tables. Jiang Qiansong blew the whistle and the whistle became more and more shrill. In his mind, he had begun to plan how to use the hidden base to make a comeback. The base was less than 100 kilometers away from Wuxia City. At this distance there were too many things to do. Jiang Qiansong will come here. When Wuxia City and even the entire Wulan state were under martial law, Qin Weibai, who should not have appeared here, was standing on a low hillside in a mountainous area nearly 100 kilometers away from Wuxia City, quietly looking at the rolling mountains in front of her. If he fails, this is his only choice. What if he wins? Lin Fengting suddenly asked. Qin Weibai glanced at him. It was possible before, she said slowly, but now Tianlan and Qin Shilai have met. What chance does Jiang Qiansong have? Lin Fengting smiled and did not ask the question in detail. He just looked at the mountainous area in his sight and asked, "Which mountain?" "Every mountain is the same. The entrance is on this mountain. It can be said that this is the largest and most secret base of the Jiang family of South America and Eastern Europe. However, the interior of the mountain has been reinforced by a special alloy that is hundreds of meters thick. If you want to enter the base, you need to go through 13 security checks. The mountains are connected but not connected. If you want to walk through the whole base without special permission, almost no one can do it by relying on brute force." Qin Weibai pointed at one of the lowest peaks. "You seem to know this place very well?" Lin Fengting looked at Qin Weibai and said meaningfully. Qin Weibai was silent for a while and whispered, "I've been here once, just once." She seemed to want to say something but finally shook her head. So, you have permission here? Lin Fengting asked. I don't. Qin Weibai shook her head. Lin Fengting frowned and thought, this place is so abnormal. You don't have permission. Do you really want me to go in with brute force? That was what he thought, so he asked directly. We don't need to go in. Qin Weibai explained calmly. I'm standing about 300 meters away from the base's cordon. This is the only way to enter the base. We just need to wait for Zhang Qiansong here. Lin Fengting still wanted to speak, but the phone suddenly rang. He took out his mobile phone and answered it. After saying a few words, he put down the phone. Qin Weibai glanced at him. According to reliable information, King Tong entered Reki City 20 minutes ago. The Vatican and Knights Templars entered Reki City 15 minutes ago. Qin Weibai's eyes flickered, but she did not speak. Lin Fengting said the most important piece of information. Tianzong has arrived in Eastern Europe, less than 20 miles away from Reki City. Qin Weibai's body suddenly tightened and she subconsciously clenched her fists. Lin Fengting looked at her for a while and said slowly, it's not too late to get there now. Qin Weibai was silent for a long time. Finally, she shook her head and said calmly, wait for Zhang Qiansong. In Reki City, Wang Tianzong doesn't dare to do anything to Tianlong. She said softly, so wait here. Is this place so important? Lin Fengting couldn't help asking. It's not important here. But Zhang Qiansong is important. If he's willing to cooperate with me, I'll give him a unique skill. Qin Weibai said calmly. What? Lin Fengting frowned. Qin Weibai smiled lightly and said simply, because I want to live. Chapter 441. Qin Weibai wanted to live. This could be said to be the most comfortable sentence Lin Fengting had heard since he entered Eastern Europe. To some extent, standing by Samsara Palace was almost equivalent to standing at the highest point of the chaos in Eastern Europe. Because of the chaotic war in the Dark World, the chaos in Eastern Europe was all led by Samsara Palace. The Dark World had been noisy and bloody for more than 3 years. Samsara Palace had participated in it and quietly promoted the situation. Finally, the general trend had become the current situation. And it was not the military counselor of Samsara Palace who planned all this. It was Qin Weibai. It was not that no one in the Dark World had noticed the actions of Samsara Palace. But in the changing general trend, even if some discerning people had found some clues, they had long been unable to stop it. No one knew what Samsara Palace wanted. And as the situation developed, no one knew what Samsara Palace wanted. Or no one dared to believe it. Because from all the signs, no matter what the final chaos in Eastern Europe was, Samsara Palace was destined to be destroyed. Was the layout that took more than 3 years to destroy itself? How funny was that? Lin Fengting did not find it funny. But he could not describe this approach. Was it affection? Was it guilt? Or was it similar to a kind of sick sustenance? He could not evaluate it. But standing at his height, he could already see the ending in advance. Qin Weibai's tendency to self-destruct was too obvious. That emotion was so obvious that it had even infected the entire Samsara Palace. Anyone who was qualified to participate in this game could almost see it. But Lin Fengting did not want Qin Weibai to die in vain. Knowing Qin Weibai's origin, he could naturally understand why Lin Su had said that Qin Weibai was related to the future prosperity of the Lin clan. That was why Lin Fengting followed Qin Weibai. If Qin Weibai died, then everything he was doing now would be meaningless. And the most important problem was that Qin Weibai wanted to die. Lin Fengting had been calm on the surface, but he had long been troubled in the dark. He was now at the peak of the invincible realm, standing at the top of the Dark World. But under the general trend of the entire Dark World, even if his sword intent was superb, he did not know how to protect Qin Weibai, who wanted to die in the midst of countless enemies. Now Qin Weibai wanted to live. This was undoubtedly the best news. Zhang Qiansong was known as Black Turtle in the Dark World, and his defense was unparalleled. If Samsara Palace could cooperate with Zhang Qiansong, it could greatly increase Qin Weibai's chances of survival. But the premise of all this was that Li Tianlong and the Jiang family of South America must win the battle. Only in this way could the desperate Jiang family of South America have the possibility to cooperate with the Samsara Palace. Lin Fengting glanced at Qin Weibai and thought, "Are you so confident that Li Tianlong can win?" Qin Weibai stood on the hillside in front of her. The night wind was blowing and the wind blew up the hem of her windbreaker. Her hands were in her pockets and her body was straight. She looked proud and lonely. In Lin Fengting's vision, there was only an exquisite and dreamy side profile. She looked up at the starry night sky with a worried look in her eyes. Worried about Li Tianlong? Lin Fengting asked in a gentle voice. Qin Weibai shook her head and suddenly said, "Who do you think His Highness is behind the follower?" Lin Fengting was stunned. Being able to drive a super expert close to the peak of the invincible realm, the strength of His Highness was self-evident. But as for who exactly it was, not a single clue. Lin Fengting shook his head and said slowly, "There must be a clue but we haven't found it yet." Qin Weibai shook her head. Lin Fengting suddenly understood something. "Is it because of the appearance of His Highness that you want to live? How dare I die when such a person exists?" Qin Weibai said calmly, "I don't know who he is but I can be sure of his origin. Before he appeared I didn't think anyone in the dark world was my opponent. Wang Tianzong is very strong, deity is extreme and the Lin clan is huge. But whether it's you Wang Tianzong or deity, you all have the limitations of this era. I can't defeat you but I have plenty of ways to make you powerless." Her voice was cold and piercing, like the wind blowing from the polar region to Eastern Europe. But this so-called His Highness is different. He has no limitations. If I die, Tianlong will not be his opponent. This has nothing to do with talent and aptitude. Some advantages can never be made up for. Is it because of Tianlong that you want to live? Lin Fengting said softly. Qin Weibai did not speak. This question was meaningless. Have you ever thought about how you will face him in the future? Lin Fengting pondered for a moment and finally asked this question. Qin Weibai was still silent, but her body was a little stiff. There were lonely stars in the night. The cold moonlight fell down and shone on her face. Her face was pale and almost transparent. Lin Fengting sighed quietly. Everyone had their own world. That was the whole meaning of life in the world. Qin Weibai's world was Li Tianlong. Only Li Tianlong. But she had no face to face her own world. "I will find him out," Qin Weibai said softly. In her mind, Li Tianlong might have many opponents. But only the mysterious highness was Li Tianlong's strongest opponent. That kind of advantage would almost make Li Tianlong have no chance of winning. She would find him out. As for what would happen after that, she did not say. Lin Fengting did not ask. "I will go to see the follower in the near future and ask him for the list," Qin Weibai said suddenly. "That's meaningless. Some important characters will definitely not be recorded. If the list is all, you can easily lock the identity of His Highness through that list. You won't be so stupid." Lin Fengting frowned. "I have to take a look at it," Qin Weibai said softly, "and it's not the only way." Lin Fengting said in a doubtful tone. "The best way is to wait. If everything goes well in the end of the chaos in Eastern Europe, it will be an opportunity for him, an opportunity that I can't make up for at all. I may still not know who he is, but according to his reaction I can determine his strength." Qin Weibai said calmly, "If he doesn't appear in Eastern Europe, it's almost certain that he hasn't entered the invincible realm yet." Lin Fengting opened his mouth. The answer was a little unexpected but when he thought about it, it didn't seem surprising. He lit a cigarette in silence and said nothing. Qin Weibai quietly looked at the silent mountains. This was the place where a long time ago, that incomparably pitiful man had massacred everyone for the sake of that hateful woman. Qin Weibai smiled. Her eyes were cold and calm without any temperature. The moonlight gathered on her. She raised her palms and looked at her hands. Her palms were slender, delicate and extremely small. Compared with the whole of Eastern Europe, this hand was even more insignificant. But this was all her strength. Qin Weibai took a deep breath and stared at her palms. She would use all her strength and all her weapons to cover the sky of Eastern Europe, which was full of shadows. When the everlasting night passed and the polar sun rose, the whole dark world would inevitably enter a new era. Chapter 442. Even through the broken castle and the fierce fighting, Jiang Qianzong's whistle was clearly transmitted to Black Ghost's ears. Black Ghost heard the whistle that meant the signal to retreat but he could not respond at all. For any aggressive combat unit, once it was suppressed in the battle, it often could not find a chance to turn over. And Black Ghost was not simply suppressed. His super attack power could not be exerted, his reaction speed could not keep up with the rhythm of the battle, and the shortcomings of weak defense were completely solved in the battle. Today Black Ghost was completely crushed by Li Tianlan. Black Ghost could only retreat. Li Tianlan was between him and Jiang Qiansong. As a result, he kept running and he could only get farther and farther away from Jiang Qiansong. The interior of the castle had been completely destroyed beyond recognition. The solid wooden stairs, the decorative armor, the bulletproof glass, the flower bed in the open air, the expensive furniture, and the electrical appliances had all been smashed. Huge cracks continued to spread on the walls. All the lights had been completely extinguished. There was no light in the castle, nor was there any light. Even the thunder and fire had completely disappeared. But the killing and fighting in the dark were getting crazier. All the power had been completely condensed by Li Tianlan. It did not spread but concentrated to the apex. The subtle light often lit up in Li Tianlan's hands for a moment and then extinguished, and then became a crazy tide of power surging in the castle. Black Ghost kept dodging in the dark, but he could not get rid of Li Tianlan. The sound of the dragon fist broke the air in the darkness, and the sharp feeling of the space being torn came to his face. Black Ghost's retreating body moved 5 or 6 meters horizontally in an instant and rushed to the railing on the second floor of the castle. The roaring and surging power of the dragon fist drowned the multifunctional metal wall on one side. In the loud vibration, the wall collapsed completely. The light next door lit up for a moment and was directly destroyed by violence. The light shone for a moment. Black Ghost turned back in a hurry, but Li Tianlan's shadow was gone. Boom! In the time it took to turn around, the huge force had smashed all the railings on the second floor, and the broken objects were flying. Li Tianlan approached Black Ghost unreasonably and clasped his shoulders with both hands. At the moment when their bodies were close to each other, their forward and backward movements were already fast to the extreme. Li Tianlan pushed Black Ghost's body directly through the wall. The sound of stone collapsing was accompanied by the sound of metal covering. Black Ghost's arms instantly appeared with a layer of extremely fragile metal arm guards. Incomparably crazy attacks poured down like a torrential storm. Black Ghost had no time to pull out the knife. His arms shook together, and the moment the violent power gathered on his arms, the dragon roared. Black Ghost's fist, which was completely wrapped in metal, rushed out. Li Tianlan clenched his fist and slammed it on Black Ghost's arm guard. Blood splattered everywhere. Vaguely, Li Tianlan's fist had revealed his bones. The seemingly fragile but extremely tough arm guard was completely shattered by the punch. Black Ghost's body took advantage of the force to retreat, but as soon as his figure moved, the sense of deadly danger behind him was once again very close to him. The mournful whistle rang out again. Black Ghost became more and more anxious. The metal arm guard was already the third piece of life-saving equipment on his body. It should have been 3 opportunities to interrupt Li Tianlan's offensive and let him fight back, but Li Tianlan was getting crazier and crazier. Black Ghost didn't even dare to think about how serious Li Tianlan's current injury was. The fighting desire and aggression shown by the opponent was completely a madman. Regardless of everything, he went forward. No matter how serious the injury was, as long as he was not dead, he could continue to fight. Black Ghost stretched out his body. He was in the air and his legs bounced lightly on the wall. He turned in an instant, trying to pass Li Tianlan and rush out of the castle. Li Tianlan rushed toward him. Black Ghost bounced in the opposite direction with the help of the wall. The figures of the two intersected for a moment. Black Ghost froze. At this moment he didn't have time to figure out what it meant. In the violent loud noise, the wall behind him had suddenly collapsed. Li Tianlan turned back and almost in the blink of an eye he was in front of Black Ghost. Black Ghost did not hesitate and rushed straight forward. The instantaneous intersection had changed the position and direction of the two. Now in front of Black Ghost was the direction of Jiang Qiansong. Rush. Black Ghost was rushing. Li Tianlan was also rushing. The condensed and violent power completely exploded around Li Tianlan. Thunderbolts and raging fire condensed into white lines flashing in the darkness. The lines were intertwined in the castle, dense like a net. Li Tianlan waved the giant net in his hand and chased after Black Ghost frantically, almost occupying the entire mountain area. The huge and somewhat exaggerated castle kept bursting and collapsing, and the crazy destructive power raged in every corner of the darkness. Li Tianlan went all the way and everything around him was shattered and collapsed. The whole castle had begun to crack and it seemed that it would collapse at any time. The violent attack covered the castle in an instant, and the power spread like an inescapable net. Black Ghost kept dodging, moving forward and backward, and the distance between him and Jiang Qiansong became longer and shorter. The shrill whistle became more and more urgent. Black Ghost's heart was anxious and impatient, and his breathing became more and more rapid. Li Tianlan was the chosen one. But after all, he was not a real invincible realm expert. In this battle, he didn't feel the slightest majesty as an invincible realm expert. The other party just grasped one of his flaws and then magnified it infinitely. This was a fighting style that just restrained him. He just needed a chance. A chance to block Li Tianlan's attack and then fight back in an instant. With his violent attack power that was enough to rank in the divine list, he could completely let the so-called chosen one fall here in the moment of the counterattack. He just needed a chance. Even if this chance was only for a second or even half a second. The power that filled almost every inch of space was still surging. Black Ghost took a step forward. In this extremely delicate time, the shrill weight was still echoing. But the power that raged everything suddenly disappeared for a moment. Li Tianlan stopped where he was. In an instant, Black Ghost almost did not hesitate. He turned around and pulled out his knife. The knife light, which almost tore the world apart, solidified all the darkness in the castle in an instant. Li Tianlan's face was pale and he looked up at the knife light. He knew that Black Ghost lacked a chance. So he gave Black Ghost a chance. The insanity devoured all his reason. In that state, Li Tianlan only knew to fight and did not guard against Black Ghost's change of direction. Now he changed his direction and rushed to Jiang Qiansong. Li Tianlan was not sure to break the stalemate between the two. At least he was not sure to break it before Black Ghost approached Jiang Qiansong. So he directly gave Black Ghost a chance. He took the initiative to stop facing Black Ghost's strongest blow. The dark knife light was like a black arc in the night. Vaguely, Li Tianlan saw Black Ghost's eyes full of extreme violence behind the knife light. Li Tianlan smiled. The silver bracelet on his arm instantly turned into a silver long sword. Li Tianlan clenched the blade. He raised the sword to his eyebrows. In such a dark environment no one would see this scene. Black Ghost would see this sword. But he would not have a chance to say anything again. The silver sword light lit up in the dark night. The sword light suddenly spread wildly in all directions. The silver light surrounded Li Tianlan like a ring. This sword intent was so illusory, not heavy, not sharp, and not even the slightest sharpness or aggressiveness. The light kept spreading and the surrounding darkness frantically poured into the halo. The silver sword light became brighter and brighter. At this moment, Li Tianlan stood in the middle of the halo, and his figure was more real and clear than ever. The halo shone on the mess around like a mirror, and even Black Ghost's knife light was clearly reflected. This scene was so familiar. It was especially so for Black Ghost. He suddenly opened his eyes wide. In an instant his eyes were full of fear. It was not until this moment that he realized that his so-called need for a chance was not enough, far from enough. Li Tianlan raised the sword edge and closed his eyes. No one had seen his sword. In other words, before he truly feared no one, this sword should not have been known by the world. In the face of Jiang Qianyan's living with heaven and earth, Li Tianlan did not choose this sword when the situation was extremely critical. And now the environment was just right, unknown. With this sword Black Ghost must die. The blade of falling stars stabbed upwards with incomparable stability. This was his swordsmanship. In his swordsmanship this sword might not be the strongest, but it was enough to bring the strongest fear to everyone. Li Tianlan had every reason to believe that if this sword was exposed now, Wang Tianzong, Gu Xingyun, and even many people who were like enemies or friends or close to him would kill him at all costs. Because this sword represented a completely unknown path. It was the same as shattering, punishing heaven and breaking the sea. This sword also had a name. Unparalleled style. Unparalleled in the world. Chapter 443. Li Tianlan stood in the light. Black Ghost stood in the darkness. In the blurred darkness, his expression was as if he had seen a ghost. Black Ghost himself was a ghost. So at this moment, seeing Li Tianlan's sword, Black Ghost even felt more terrible than seeing a living ghost. When he turned around and pulled out the knife with all his strength, he thought of many possibilities. Moreover, he was prepared for every possibility. But in any case he did not expect to see Li Tianlan's sword. Unprecedented fear rose from his heart. In a dark environment the light was clearly reflected in his sight. This was an indescribable sword light. Pure, bright, dazzling. Pure with almost no impurities. The turbulent darkness around continued to converge toward the light. A misty light swallowed the darkness, slowly spread and completely wrapped Li Tianlan. There was nothing in the misty and bright sword light. At this moment, Li Tianlan didn't even have killing intent. The misty sword energy was slowly gathering. There was only light. Pure light. Inside the light it was calm. Li Tianlan stood in the light curtain and looked at the darkness outside. The expression on his pale face was equally calm. Outside the light curtain, there was a monstrous killing intent. Black Ghost's face was full of fear and even despair. But he took the initiative to pull out the knife to fight back. This knife could not be turned back at all. In his sight the sword light around Li Tianlan had stopped spreading. The light outlined a perfect circle in the darkness. The light reflected everything. Li Tianlan stood in the light like standing in a mirror as if he did not belong to this world. Black Ghost's knife light rushed over. His body also rushed over. After this knife, Black Ghost did not know what the end would be. But he was sure that if he did not use this knife he would die. A desperate situation of life and death. This was a real no choice. Forward. He could only move forward. At the moment when light and darkness intertwined, Black Ghost suddenly let out a long howl like a beast. His eyes were filled with a strange red light for a moment. As the light and darkness were getting closer and closer, Black Ghost's knife momentum suddenly changed from a sweep to the most overbearing vertical cut. Blood burst out of Black Ghost's body at the moment when he forcibly reversed the knife momentum. Black Ghost's breath was instantly weak, but the knife light in the darkness became more and more crazy. He wanted a chance to fight back. Li Tianlan gave him the opportunity. But when Black Ghost seized this opportunity he realized that he had a chance but only once. If he couldn't kill Li Tianlan with this strike, there would be no future. So the Black Ghost burned everything. All the power, all the potential. As long as he could live, even if he was severely injured or even dropped in cultivation, it was not something he could not accept. The pure sword light was absorbing the darkness. Wherever the pitch-black saber light passed the space would shatter inch by inch. A pitch-black arc of light that was several tens of meters long appeared in the pitch-black castle. The arc of light descended from above like a black lightning, crazily striking the pure sword light around Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan still maintained the posture of holding the sword with both hands. He raised his head quietly and looked at the knife light and Black Ghost jumping out of the darkness. The pitch-black arc of light collided with the pure sword light. The crazy and ruthless sharpness and killing intent tore at the pure mirror-like light at all costs. The light around Li Tianlan fluctuated violently, like boiling water, like a sudden surging tide. The collision of light and darkness spread around, and the obscure light penetrated the walls and the ceiling. With the position of the two as the center, everything within hundreds of meters of the castle turned into a piece of powder in an instant. The pitch-black saber light cut the light curtain around Li Tianlan wildly. Black Ghost had completely put down everything and madly slashed. Killing. Extinction. Annihilation. All the unique skills seemed to become the most common moves in his hands. Countless blood spurted out from his body as he waved his saber. Black Ghost howled miserably. Wherever the saber light passed, the pure sword light had been completely surrounded by dense black arcs of light. Li Tianlan's pure mirror-like sword light had been completely distorted, but in the face of Black Ghost's desperate attack, the light curtain had never been broken. Invincible. The light screen was so pure that it didn't have any sword chi or killing intent. This sword was pure light and didn't have any attack power, but it represented absolute defense. Black Ghost waved his saber wildly, and he didn't even know how many times he had waved. In fact, the first few sabers almost exhausted all Black Ghost's strength. The later countless sabers, the more powerful they were, the less powerful they were. The final few sabers were not even at the fire-flaming realm. But Black Ghost still persistently waved the weapon in his hand. His body was trembling. Looking at the unbreakable light curtain, his eyes had gradually become dull. His movements were getting slower and slower. But with his movements, the thin and somewhat ridiculous saber light was constantly waving, and the light curtain around Li Tianlan had been distorted to the limit. The dull sound of air bursting rang out. Pieces of pure light began to collapse. The entire light screen shattered and countless light dots danced in the air as they rushed into the darkness, disappearing in an instant. There was no excitement in Black Ghost's eyes. Instead, he became extremely desperate. Sure enough, it was this sword. Unexpectedly, it was really this sword. Li Tianlan held falling stars with both hands and the blade turned calmly. It was as if he had passed through a mirror that reflected light. In an instant the light receded. The same pure silence and darkness without any impurities suddenly broke out in front of Li Tianlan. The sword energy rose to the sky and destroyed everything. Unparalleled style. Two completely different sword intents were the most complete unparalleled style. The pure light represented absolute defense. And pure darkness was the ultimate destruction. Boom! In the dark silence, there was a sudden earth-shattering explosion. The darkness completely swallowed Li Tianlan. The place where he was like an exploding black hole. The darkness, which was enough to swallow any light, burst out completely in an instant like a surging tsunami. Black Ghost was drowned. The broken castle hall was drowned. The open-air garden was drowned. The power of extreme destruction seemed to be endless, filling the castle in the blink of an eye. All the sounds of bursting and collapsing turned into a loud noise at the same time. Standing in this mountain area, Rekvia Castle, known as the strongest war fortress in Eastern Europe, completely collapsed in the sudden outbreak of the Black Tide. The pure dark sword intent rushed out of the castle, obscuring the starlight, mighty. Li Tianlan stood in the very center of the darkness, his body trembling violently. At this point the gene potion he had taken before finally lost its effect with his full strength. The injury from the battle with Jiang Qianyan. The injury from the battle with Jiang Qiansong. The injury from the joint attack of Black Ghost and Jiang Qiansong. The internal and external injuries, every wound was gushing blood. The injury began to bite back at the body like never before. Li Tianlan's eyes turned black. His body shook and he tried his best to concentrate his will and not let himself fall to the ground. The blood completely dyed his broken white cloud silk clothes red. Li Tianlan, covered with blood and dust, looked like a beggar. But in the darkness, his whole person was full of unprecedented majesty. Because after the darkness dissipated, the African Black Ghost, who was strong enough to be on the holy list, was kneeling in front of him in the most humiliating way. The dark sword intent completely wiped out all his vitality. The sword light passed through every inch of his body. Every muscle on his body was completely torn by the sword intent, and even his internal organs had become fragmented. The vitality kept disappearing in his body. His body trembled. Before he died, he didn't even feel fear, just obvious doubts and puzzlement. Why? Black Ghost struggled to raise his head. He seemed to realize how humiliating his posture was. He tried to move and seemed to want to turn over. Bang! In the subtle sound, one of his slightly exerted arms suddenly exploded. The blood mist flew and scattered on Black Ghost. Black Ghost's face was completely distorted, but his eyes were fixed on Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and looked at Black Ghost. This was the first time he had killed an invincible realm expert with his own strength. It was not the outbreak of life that he gave up in Heaven Capital. No one paid the price. He also paid the price. The dual wind and thunder veins had become dual veins of wind and thunder. The imperfect, unparalleled style was destined to be difficult to appear for a long time. His injury had reached the limit and then he needed careful nursing. But he killed an invincible realm expert. So Li Tianlan was now in the mood to chat with Black Ghost. Why what? His voice was hoarse and weak. 1001. The Road of the Chosen One. Illusion and reality. Why is there light and darkness? Why can it be at the same time, at the same time? He tried to gasp to express his meaning. For nearly 500 years in the Dark World, the Li family and the Wang family of Beihai had been standing at the peak of the Dark World. The 24 moves of sword and the 6 paths of reincarnation represented the extreme of swordsmanship and the extreme of martial arts. Above the extreme was the real road of the Chosen One. So there were only 2 ways to become the Chosen One in the Dark World. Many experts in the Dark World knew what this was, but they might not be able to do it. The sword intent of the 24 moves of sword reached the extreme. Beyond the extreme, it was the sword intent of reality and illusion. It was sharp and unparalleled, destroying everything. The road of the 6 paths of reincarnation surpassed the extreme, which was light and darkness. This was the strongest outbreak, and it was a two-sided outbreak. Light was the ultimate defense, and darkness was the absolute destruction. Between day and night, the attack power and defense power of the outbreak almost doubled. These were the only 2 roads of the Chosen One that could be seen in the Dark World. The Jiang family of South America was not qualified to take such a road. However, Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost joined forces with the help of the domain of 30-meter mortal world, combining defense and attack, and they could infinitely close to this point. That was infinitely close to perfection. This was also the reason why the Jiang family of South America was full of confidence in Eastern Europe. When Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost joined forces, they could almost fight against the experts at the peak of the invincible realm, because they represented an incomparably perfect road. And now, Li Tianlan. After the sword intent of reality and illusion, the move of unparalleled just now, the alternation of light and darkness, the conversion of day and night, was clearly another road of true perfection. Why? Black Ghost muttered to himself, still persistent. 2 roads of the Chosen One, reality and illusion, light and darkness. Why do you? Li Tianlan frowned. What nonsense is this? He glanced at Black Ghost and said, martial arts is martial arts. What's the use of these fancy things? His body moved and he took a step forward. This step seemed to destroy the balance of the whole space. The darkness of nothingness surged over and completely wrapped Black Ghost. Black Ghost opened his mouth, only uttered a syllable, and the whole person was completely swallowed by the darkness. His figure broke up little by little in the darkness, turned into flesh and blood and turned into dust. Black Ghost died. At the same time, Li Tianlan began to bleed all over. The blood washed the dust on his body, extremely red and mournful. He knelt on the ground, dizzy, and could hardly stand up for a while. No one could have predicted that this would be the result of this battle. The invincible realm died. The Chosen One was bathed in blood. Li Tianlan clenched his fists and struggled to stand up. In the darkness, his voice sounded low, very hoarse but very firm. I also have a sword. Chapter 444. Zhongzhou State was still silent. It was still noisy on the international stage. The meeting of the United Nations had long since ended, but great pressure was still surging toward Zhongzhou State. From morning to night, this was destined to be an abrupt and subtle day. Wulan State, Oga State and Ross State completely fell out with Zhongzhou State. All the major powers in the world exerted pressure on Zhongzhou State. The turbulent day gradually came to an end. Countless conspiracies were brewing in a frenzied and noisy atmosphere. Only a few people found that in this general trend, Wulan State, Oga State and Ross State, which should have been the most excited, were suddenly silent. They became as silent as Zhongzhou State. Since the evening, the spokespersons of the 3 countries had never made any remarks against Zhongzhou State, because they had lost contact with Xianxia, the patriarch of the Rekvia family. The Rekvia castle was very close to Reki City. In the shortest time since the battle in the castle, the high-level officials of Wulan State had already received the news. It was a chaotic battle on the satellite's surveillance screen. Jiang Qiansong, Black Ghost, Li Tianlan, Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud, countless experts of the Rekvia family, Dark Sword Master Qin Shilai. In the light and shadow that filled the whole scene, most of the high-level officials of Wulan State were watching the scene in silence. They did not see Xianxia, the patriarch of the Rekvia family, but they saw Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost attacking the Rekvia castle. In the high-level conference room of Reki City, every high-level official of Wulan State who saw this scene felt a little strange. No matter what the situation was, at least now it seemed that Rekvia had changed its camp and stood in Li Tianlan's camp. What an embarrassing situation this was. 12 hours ago, Wulan State had taken the initiative to declare war on Zhongzhou State. If Rekvia joined the camp of Zhongzhou State, how could Wulan State deal with itself? The declaration of war between Wulan State and Zhongzhou State was the result of the strong influence of the Rekvia family. In capitalist countries, capital itself had unimaginable magic and power. The entire Rekvia family was a huge monster entrenched in the 5 Eastern European countries. Their capital controlled all the important industries in several countries. Countless parliamentarians, generals and senior officials kept in touch with them. All the media spoke for them. It was no exaggeration to say that as long as the Patriarch of Rekvia wanted to, he could easily resound throughout the 5 Eastern European countries with a cough. Wulan state might have the power to resist Rekvia. But the government of Wulan state did not. Xianxia ordered Wulan state to declare war on Zhou state. As long as someone did not execute it, whether it was the president or the prime minister, they would be ousted the next day. This was the power of capital. That was why the senior officials of Wulan state felt embarrassed. In less than 24 hours after the country declared war with Zhou state, Rekvia shook hands with Zhou state. How would Wulan state face Zhou state? Every senior executive was silent, and the atmosphere in the conference room was as stiff as ice. Many people here were related to the Rekvia family, and some even came from the Rekvia family. But from their political standpoint, no matter what relationship they had with Rekvia, everyone felt ashamed when they thought of the situation after Rekvia shook hands with Zhou state. The communication screen in the conference room suddenly changed. An old general with a grizzled beard appeared on the screen, his expression solemn and dignified. All the higher-ups focused their attention on him at the same time. The old general saluted with a solemn face, took a deep breath and slowly said, "Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, the Grand Duke of England, the Queen of the Shadow Throne of the European Union, King Tong Rothschild, requests to enter Reki City." The president of Wulan state, whose expression was calm and almost numb, did not speak. The prime minister on the side was slightly shocked. Rothschild was the top wealthy family in Europe, which was enough to keep pace with the Wang family of Beihai. Such a family dominated the United Kingdom and had been Grand Dukes for generations. In this generation, the title of Grand Duke fell on King Tong of Rothschild. She was not the Patriarch of Rothschild. But the title of Queen of the Shadow Throne and Grand Duke of Rothschild was enough to show that at this moment Rothschild and the Shadow Throne, which could be said to be supreme in Western Europe, had set their sights on Reki City at the same time. There was a long silence. The communication never hung up. After an unknown period of time, a noise suddenly sounded from the screen. Another voice sounded on the screen. It was also a report, but it sounded from the old general's communication device. The old general did not block the call, so the news reported to the old general was directly transmitted to the ears of all the high-level officials of Wulan state. Report General His Highness Angel, the Holy Virgin of the Vatican, His Highness Mellad, the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps, and His Highness Chaos, the Grand Knight of Knights Templars, request to enter Reki City. The old general on the screen froze for a moment, then looked at the high-level officials in the conference room and fell silent. There was a sound of rapid breathing in the depressing conference room. The president, who was expressionless, moved his body, glanced at the old general and nodded slightly. The old general hesitated, nodded slightly, picked up the communication device and said in a deep voice, "Let them go. It seems that the situation is not that bad." The president, who had been silent for a long time, smiled, and his smile was a little self-deprecating. The Snowdance Corps, the Jiang family of South America, the Qin clan of Eastern Europe, Rothschild, the Vatican, and Knights Templars. In a small place like Wulan state, there were 6 major forces involved in the competition in a day. Plus the local Rekvia of Wulan state. The situation was extremely chaotic. But we always have to find someone to cooperate with. The president of Wulan state said slowly. Before the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, the entire Dark World in Eastern Europe was controlled by the Polar Ground Alliance. The Polar Ground Alliance was controlled by the 4 major families in Eastern Europe. The 4 families, who controlled countless interests, transferred the interests of the Dark World to the countries in Eastern Europe. Therefore, when the Polar Ground Alliance existed, the countries in Eastern Europe did not worry about the war in the Dark World. But now that the Polar Ground Alliance had collapsed, Wulan state, which was controlled by Rekvia, suddenly seemed extremely fragile. Under such circumstances, Wulan state must find a dark force to cooperate with, just like East Island chose the Purgatory of Heaven capital at the beginning. The war in the Dark World was sometimes very huge and sometimes very small. But it was undeniable that every large-scale conflict in the Dark World was extremely sensitive. The focus of the Dark World's competition was basically related to the fate of the country. No country dared to let an uncontrolled Dark World develop unscrupulously in its own territory. Therefore, many countries had only 2 choices in the face of foreign forces, either to expel or to cooperate. In the case of the latter, It was usually because these countries did not have enough power to carry out the expulsion. This was the last resort. Wulan State's geographical location was extremely important, and it had always been a battleground for military forces. More than 20 years ago, Zhou State established the Arctic Ocean Command, and the best target was Wulan State. At that time, the Li family of Zhou State was like the sun at high noon, and the two highnesses were invincible. With the full support of Zhou State and the assistance of the Wang family of Beihai, the Arctic Ocean Command experienced countless wars before and after its establishment. The Li family, which had countless chips, encountered the unified rejection and resistance of all the European powers and wealthy families in Eastern Europe, including Rothschild. In the end, the Li family still opened up a situation in Eastern Europe and established the Arctic Ocean Command. But there was no room for the Li family to intervene in the 5 Eastern European countries with Wulan State as the core. Wulan State was a large European country, rich in all kinds of resources and a world-famous granary. Its location determined its importance. Between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, Wulan State was the most important focus and the most natural channel. Moreover, the coastline of Wulan State could go straight to Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and East Asia. It was no exaggeration to say that if Zhou State had occupied this place back then, it would have contained the throat of the entire Europe. The major powers in Western Europe were not interested in the Arctic Ocean Command in Eastern Europe. They just did not want the Li family to occupy Wulan State and pose too much threat to themselves in their rear. In fact, they did. The Arctic Ocean Command was established. The Li family withdrew from Eastern Europe. However, the entire Arctic Ocean Command in Eastern Europe was completely cut off by several countries around Wulan State. For more than 20 years, its deterrent was still seriously insufficient. Now the Polar Ground Alliance had collapsed and Zhou State had made a comeback. It was still the Li family and it was still as chaotic as before. But the current Li family was not as good as it was in the past. At present, any superpower that entered Wulan State was fully interested in cooperating with Wulan State. Wulan State could choose Zhou State, Rothschild, the Vatican, and the Jiang family of South America. But everything was just in theory. In such a chaotic situation, if Wulan State, which was not strong in comprehensive national strength, rashly chose, it would only bring disaster to itself. The president thought silently and suddenly broke the silence in the conference room. Reki City opens all the city defenses. There was a moment of silence in the conference room, and then it was drowned in an uproar. The president looked at the incredible expressions of many high-level officials and said calmly, "Now Wulan State is the freest but also the most powerless. We have to cooperate with other forces in any case. In this case, let's open the city defense, let all forces come in and let them fight." He paused and said flatly, "We will only choose the winner." The communication in the conference room was suddenly connected again. The old general's figure appeared on the screen again. His expression was still serious, but the muscles at the corners of his eyes were constantly trembling at this time. The president looked at him and did not speak. "Everyone," the old general's voice was extremely low so it sounded very weak. "I've got the news." His voice was like a dying moan. The Sword Emperor of Zhou State, Wang Tianzong, has entered Reki City and is currently heading for Rekvia Castle. The uproar in the conference room suddenly became dead silent. Wang Tianzong, the Sword Emperor of Zhou State. The first on the divine list. Not to mention his Wang family of Beihai. He was alone. For a country with weak national strength like Wulan State, Wang Tianzong alone represented a power that Wulan State could not resist. No one dared to speak. No one in the conference room could see Wang Tianzong. But just by hearing this name, everyone seemed to feel the majesty of a monarch descending from the North Sea to Eastern Europe. The majesty of the Sword Emperor. The Wang family of Beihai also intervened. The president's palm trembled for a moment and he suddenly asked, "Where is the Snowdance Corps?" "Less than 20 kilometers from Reki City." The old general's tone was heavy. "How are their losses?" The president took a deep breath, and his eyes suddenly became extremely sharp. "More than 2/3 of the 3,000 people have been lost, but they have marched all the way through 6 large elite legions of ours. At present, nearly half of the military of Wulan State has been completely defeated by the Snowdance Corps." The old general said with a wry smile, "It is expected that they will arrive outside Reki City in 40 minutes at most." President, what should we do? In the conference room, a hot-tempered senior military official suddenly stood up and asked loudly. Wait. The president's tone was low and brief. The present, we can only wait. Everyone, tonight's change may not be enough to determine the future of Eastern Europe, but it is enough to determine the future of Wulan state. We only choose the winner no matter who it is, so. He stood up and bowed deeply to all the senior officials in the conference room. Please support me. Everyone looked at the president and no one spoke. Everyone understood that the fate of Wulan state depended on the victory or defeat of several major forces. They could do nothing now. After the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, the most vulnerable side of Wulan state completely broke out tonight, making every senior official of Wulan state helpless. They could choose. But they could only choose the winner. But there was only one winner. So the so-called choice in fact was that they had no choice. Chapter 445. You sat on the boat and watched the scenery. The person who watched the scenery was watching you upstairs. His sight passed through the hazy misty rain of West Lake. The rippling surface of the lake brought about dense mist. The bell rang from the temple not far away. The bell spread in all directions, distant and empty. West Lake in the rain was extremely beautiful. In a trance, all he could see were sceneries. West Lake, bright moon tower. He sat in an elegant private room filled with the fragrance of tea. Through the window, his eyes had been looking at a lonely boat on the lake. The lonely boat was far away from Bright Moon Tower, so far that the lonely boat seemed very small. Because the person on the lonely boat was even smaller. The boat on the water was faintly discernible, drifting aimlessly. A vague figure was sitting on the bow of the boat. He seemed to be fishing, motionless, and looked extremely quiet. In the private room, he watched quietly, picked up the slightly cold tea on the table and took a sip. The wind suddenly blew outside the window. As the wind passed, it rolled up the hazy misty rain, wrinkled the surface of the lake, and disturbed the leisurely spreading ripples and the lonely boat. The boat swayed in the wind, getting closer to Bright Moon Tower. His hand that was drinking tea paused slightly. Looking at the vague figure fishing on the boat, he narrowed his eyes. It's still too late after all. He put down the teacup and whispered to himself. What's too late? An old voice rang out. The door of the private room was pushed open, and an old man about 60 years old came in. He gently stroked the teacup and did not speak. He did not like to explain and he did not want to say too much in front of his own people. What is His Majesty looking at? The old man asked again. There were only two majesties recognized in the world. One was in the Vatican. The other was in Beihai. Nowadays only a few people knew that in addition to these two, there was another majesty in the dark world. Almost no one knew his identity and origin. And those who knew would not tell others. So at present His Majesty was simply a perfect secret figure. He sat in the corner of the private room and the dim light shrouded his figure. He smiled, knocked on the table, looked at the lake outside the window and whispered, I'm watching the night. His voice was calm and indifferent, neither too fast nor too slow, which sounded very magnetic. The old man glanced out of the window blankly. It was raining in Lin. But when night fell in Eastern Europe, it happened to be daytime here. Although the weather was gloomy, how could there be night? The boat on the lake came nearer. Following His Majesty's gaze, the old man finally discovered something. He frowned and suddenly cried out involuntarily, Wei Kunlun. He should be a saint. His eyes were steady and firm as he looked at the lake. The night is too bright. He is not a threat on the trip to Eastern Europe. You want to kill him. The old man's eyes were still filled with shock, but the light of contemplation began to surge in the depths of his eyes. If I go all out, I said it's too late. His Majesty shook his head. The old man fell silent. After a while he shook his head with a wry smile. I didn't expect that the strongest sword master of Mount Shu would be the first super master of Samsara Palace. There's nothing strange about that. Similarly, no one would have thought that the deputy commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican would be my disciple. His Majesty stood up, poured a cup of tea for the old man, pointed to the opposite side of him and said casually, Sit down. The old man sat down and looked seriously at His Majesty's face, which was a little blurred in the shadows. The disciple is still in the Vatican. Do you really want to get involved in the Vatican? His Majesty paused, then shook his head with a smile. Of course not. The Pope is unfathomable and the Vatican has a transcendent status and powerful strength, but there are too many restrictions. I'm not interested in the Vatican. The reason why the disciple stays there is that he was already there when I found him. In fact, how to let the disciple leave the Vatican is also one of the things I've thought about most in recent years. If this matter is not done well, it may be a problem in the future. The Holy Disarmament Corps has a sensitive position. If you want the disciple to leave the Vatican, you must let him leave the Holy Disarmament Corps first. The old man frowned. I know. His Majesty said lightly, wait until the matter in Eastern Europe is over. Eastern Europe is an opportunity. If possible, I'd like the disciple to kill Arsis. The old man raised his eyebrows, looking blank and confused. Arsis and I had a grudge back then. His Majesty's tone was cold. The corners of the old man's mouth twitched. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. It had been more than 30 years since the Pope of the Vatican was elected. Arsis had been in charge of the Holy Disarmament Corps for more than 20 years. In the state of coronation, Arsis could be said to be second only to the Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong, and even comparable to deity. He really didn't know what grudge His Majesty had with Arsis. When I passed by Europe, I wanted to invite their Holy Virgin to dinner. Listen, it was just a meal to discuss some things. There was no other meaning. But Arsis thought that I had profaned the inviolable glory of the Holy Virgin. Hey, 2 invincible realm experts and hundreds of advanced saint warriors chased me for nearly 600 kilometers. Of course, I have to remember this. His Majesty sneered and his tone was full of indifference. The old man hesitated. The disciple was still in the Vatican. He really didn't want to become enemies with the Vatican. If possible, he still hoped that His Majesty could let go of these grudges. Your Majesty, the Holy Virgin of the Vatican has a very high status in the Vatican. In terms of her identity, she really won't eat alone with a strange man. What you did, the old man said in a euphemistic tone. I know. His Majesty interrupted him. If that's all, I don't want to care about it. You know, I also have faith, although I'm not a Christian. But no one can deny my piety. Do you think that a firm faith will be completely shattered by a powerful force? Absolutely not. The old man shook his head firmly. So, Your Majesty, it's understandable that Arsis chased you. I don't understand. His Majesty shook his head and said with a sneer, if a devout faith really can't be defeated, then why didn't I invite their Holy Virgin to dinner back then? But it didn't take long for Arsis and the Pope to give their Holy Virgin to another man. The Pope was even willing to preside over their wedding in person and even keep her identity as the Holy Virgin. Ah, a married Holy Virgin? How ridiculous is that? The old man opened his mouth and looked at His Majesty dully. He didn't speak for a long time. He asked the Pope and the commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps to give their Holy Virgin away and even allowed the married Holy Virgin to keep her identity as the Holy Virgin. In the old man's impression, it seemed that there had never been such a powerful and frightening figure in the dark world. This was tantamount to overturning the entire Vatican with his own strength. How insignificant was the Vatican in front of the other party that they would compromise like this? The old man's tone was bitter. It seems that no Holy Virgin of the Vatican has ever married, of course. His Majesty said expressionlessly, the Holy Virgin that they regarded as a treasure had no value in the other party's eyes. The Vatican was willing to marry her, but that person didn't bother to marry her. So in the end, the so-called Holy Virgin still kept her name, but she followed that person for no reason. When I met that person, the so-called Holy Virgin poured me a cup of tea. Holy Virgin. Holy Virgin. He took out a cigarette, slowly lit it and calmly said, let me tell you a story. Go ahead. The old man's tone was respectful. 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, there used to be a chosen one in Zhongzhou state. The old man listened in silence without saying a word. It's just that the chosen one also had a woman he liked. Unfortunately, that year the Jiang family of South America spent countless resources to kidnap the chosen one's woman. In order to resist the great pressure brought by the chosen one, the Jiang family of South America invited the Pope, Arsis, the Heroes Club and Fantasy World, several superpowers, intending to fight against the other party together. Just for that woman, His Majesty smiled. That man, who was either a fool or a chosen one, killed all the way from South America to Eastern Europe. He swept the 6 secret bases of the Jiang family of South America and slaughtered nearly 13,000 elites of the Jiang family of South America. Finally, he found the woman in the secret base in Eastern Europe. And then, the old man couldn't help asking, feeling like he was listening to a story. And then, His Majesty said indifferently, 3 invincible realm experts who were strong enough to be on the divine list died on the spot. The entire secret base was in disorder. Thousands of elites were killed. Arceus was seriously injured. The Jiang family of South America suffered heavy losses. As for the Pope, he avoided the Chosen One's 5 swords in a row. Finally, he couldn't stand the 6th sword and took the initiative to compromise. Even when the so-called Holy Virgin went to serve tea and warm the bed, he didn't dare to revoke her title. The old man had completely shut up and his eyes were full of fascination. When the nobility and dignity of the beautiful Holy Virgin were associated with serving tea and warming the bed, some of the reveries in it were enough to stimulate any man, including the old man. Just listen to it as a story. His Majesty put out the cigarette butt and smiled. It's a story. The old man nodded with a hollow smile. Go to Eastern Europe now. His Majesty said calmly, in the chaos of Wulan state, if nothing goes wrong, Li Tianlan will win. Lin Fengting is with Qin Weibai, so it's impossible for the Qin clan not to help Li Tianlan. Jiang Qiansong has no hope of turning the tables, so he will retreat to his secret base in Eastern Europe as soon as possible. I can know the location of the secret base, so there's no reason that Qin Weibai doesn't know. I've sent someone to keep an eye on it. All the manpower is at your disposal. Don't have any conflict with Qin Weibai. There's only one thing you have to do. If Jiang Qiansong can escape from Qin Weibai and Lin Fengting's blockade and make sure that we won't be exposed, save him. I have great use for him. The old man froze and looked at the time. It should be more than 7 o'clock in the evening in Wulan state now. It would take him at least 10 hours to get from Lin An to Wulan state. Is it too late? The old man asked. It's just a casual move. If Jiang Qiansong is lucky, it's naturally too late. If he dies, just follow the original plan. His Majesty shook his head and said calmly, I'll go to Eastern Europe a little later. But to go, I have to determine the state of some people who may affect the situation. As he spoke, his eyes were fixed on Wei Kunlun. Wei Kunlun? No, Saint, he may pose a threat. But for now he has no hope of breaking through and is not a threat. His Majesty shook his head. Who is military counselor? The old man suddenly asked. How do I know? His Majesty asked in reply. Looking at the old man's incredible expression, he smiled and said, I know a lot of things, but it doesn't mean that I'm omniscient and omnipotent. Some things are secrets and they are secrets. How can I know who is military counselor? But Saint is not a threat, and military counselor's current state is not much better. Neither of them is a threat. The old man was silent for a while, then nodded and said, Since the 2 strongest supermasters of the Samsara Palace are not a threat, who told you that Saint and military counselor are the strongest supermasters of the Samsara Palace? His Majesty said calmly. The old man suddenly froze on the spot. Qin Weibai has contributed a lot to the Samsara Palace's success today. She is an amazing woman, but remember, when she is your enemy, you can't believe everything she says or does. When His Majesty talked about Qin Weibai, there was undisguised appreciation in his eyes. She is an awe-inspiring woman, so I will help her and kill her in the chaos of Eastern Europe. This is the only, maybe not the only one. A low voice suddenly sounded at the door. A middle-aged man in a white shirt with a calm and dignified bearing came in. The old man looked up and was stunned. The middle-aged man was also stunned when he saw the old man. The next second, the two laughed at the same time and shook hands. Secretary Wang, His Majesty greeted him with a smile. Welcome. The person who came to the Bright Moon Tower at such a delicate time was Wang Jinglei, the current member of the decision-making committee of Zhongzhou State, the core member of the Wang family of Beihai, and the top leader of Wuxia province. Wang Jinglei waved his hand with a smile, sat opposite His Majesty and said with a smile, We are all on the same side. Why are you so polite? Chapter 446. The idiot called Wang Jinglei Wang Jinglei. It has been changed. Wang Jinglei said that he and His Majesty were on the same side. What everyone knew was that he and the other king were truly on the same side. The rift within the Wang family of Beihai was getting bigger and bigger, and Wang Qinglei was definitely the focus of it. But even so, no one dared to say that Wang Qinglei and Wang Tianzong would completely break up. Even if he finally ascended to the commanding heights of Zhongzhou state and stood at the peak of the highest power in Zhongzhou state, no one thought that Wang Qinglei would have such courage. But today, the ordinary-looking old man looked at Wang Qinglei thoughtfully and then at His Majesty who was sitting in the shadow. An idea suddenly came to his mind. Was the cause or the starting point of the rift in the Wang family of Beihai in recent years? It seemed that although His Majesty had been hiding in the dark in recent years, he had done something. Although it was hard to believe that he could do this, the old man knew very well that there were always some people who had advantages that most people would not have in their lives. The old man thought and glanced at His Majesty in the shadow. His Majesty didn't respond. The old man thought about it. Since His Majesty didn't let him go now, he simply sat down beside him. His Majesty's expression was still calm. So Wang Qinglei was completely relieved. Wasn't his saying that he was on the same side as His Majesty? From their current standpoint, he was sure that he and His Majesty were on the same side, but Wang Qinglei was not sure that the old man appeared here. Now he sat down and His Majesty didn't object, which meant that the other party was indeed on the same side. Wang Qinglei smiled, looked at the calm old man and said with a smile, "General, I didn't expect to see you here. It's an accident and a surprise." He stood up and reached out to the old man. The old man, who was really important in Zhongzhou state but didn't have a strong sense of existence, reached out to hold Wang Qinglei's palm, and said in a hoarse voice, "I didn't expect to see the secretary here either." The secretary was not an ordinary secretary. The general was not an ordinary general either. One of the four spirits of Zhongzhou state, Admiral of 9 Serenities Shang. His code name was Vermilion Bird. In the shadow, His Majesty straightened up and said with a smile, "Secretary Wang, let me introduce you. This is my third follower." Among the 4 spirits of Zhongzhou state, except for Black Tortoise who was still young, the other 3 were the top superiors of the half-step invincible realm in the Dark World. The second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican. The Sword Sage of East Island. The General of Zhongzhou state. They were all disciples. They were all big spenders. Wang Qinglei shook Shang's old and thin palm hard, looked at His Majesty in the shadow and smiled peacefully. "It seems that you are going to make a big move in Eastern Europe? Are they targeting Qin Weibai? You seem to have a different opinion?" His Majesty asked with a smile. "It's just an idea." Qin Weibai's charm was unparalleled. Her appearance, temperament, scheming and wits were all impeccable. It would be a pity to kill such a beautiful woman. If she could become your woman, who would be your opponent in this era? It's much better for you to be with Qin Weibai than for her to be with Li Tianlan. At least in my heart, you and her are truly made for each other," Wang Qinglei said in a gentle voice. His Majesty did not speak for a while. The shadow he was in was a little dim and Wang Qinglei could see that he was in a trance. This trance passed in a flash and then it became absolute reason and calmness. "It's impossible." His tone was cold and deep. Wang Qinglei raised his eyebrows. "Even if I can get all the women in the world, I can't get Qin Weibai." His Majesty's tone was complicated. "The world wants to live but she wants to die." "Why?" Wang Qinglei froze for a moment. "Because of guilt, right?" His Majesty laughed. "Maybe it's also because of deep love? How do I know? She's not an ordinary woman. Everyone has their own world and everyone's world is wonderful. But maybe only her world is boring. So boring that there's only snow, blood and Li Tianlan. This is her world, the world she has no face to face." He turned the teacup in his hand and said flatly, "No one can get her. I can't get her and neither can Li Tianlan. Everything she did in Eastern Europe was a self-destructive plan. When she dies, what's the point of gains and losses? But if," Shang suddenly opened his mouth and said slowly, "what if she knows the existence of your Majesty?" There was no need to assume this question. Because Qin Weibai already knew the existence of this Majesty. She will want to survive. Because she can't rest assured about Li Tianlan. His Majesty said, "But it's all meaningless. The reason why I appear in her sight at this time is that nothing can be changed. He has done all this. How can she survive under the general trend? At this time, even if she wants to live, she has no chance. But there will be variables. Wang Qinglei said. If Qin Weibai survived the chaos in Eastern Europe, it was definitely not a good thing for the people present. I allow variables to exist, His Majesty said, although it's also very helpless because I can't grasp the direction of the chaos in Eastern Europe. Qin Weibai will die, but the ending she wants may not necessarily appear. I have to help her because the new era she wants to create is what I need most. So I simply jumped out. He smiled and turned to look at Shang. So, when you go to Eastern Europe this time, you must pay attention to a few people. Go ahead. Shang said calmly. The first is naturally His Majesty Sword Emperor. But with Secretary Wang, you can get a lot of information about His Majesty Sword Emperor, so his threat is the lowest. Shang didn't speak and listened quietly. The second is Qin Weibai. Remember, don't expose your relationship with me under any circumstances. As for the third, Shang still didn't speak. Without His Majesty's words, he knew that the third person His Majesty mentioned was Lin Fengting. It could only be Lin Fengting. It's the Qin clan. His Majesty gave an unexpected answer. The first branch of the Lin clan had a deep foundation in Eastern Europe. Pay attention to the Qin clan's movements, which can even affect the whole situation. The fourth, Shang looked up at His Majesty and thought that the fourth must be Lin Fengting. It's tribulation. Tribulation. Shang and Wang Qinglei were both surprised. Why not Lin Fengting? Lin Fengting is terrible, but some enemies don't have to be defeated. At present, in the chaos in Eastern Europe, the only one who can really sweep everything unscrupulously is His Majesty Sword Emperor, so we need to pay attention to him. Only Qin Weibai can overturn the overall situation quietly, so we also need to pay attention to her. The Qin clan has a deep foundation in Eastern Europe and can't be ignored either. In addition to these three parties, what I've mentioned are those who would rather die to protect Li Tianlan. Tribulation can do this, but his current state should be a little special. When you go to Eastern Europe, you need to send people to stand up to Tribulation and the Holy Virgin Angel of the Vatican. Shang stared silently. He was very old, but at this moment, looking at His Majesty in front of him, he finally thought of a term that belonged to young people. It was a term that his granddaughter would repeat when she played games all day. A cheat. For this era, His Majesty in front of him was a real cheat. And Qin Weibai was also a cheat. The point was that they were all controlled by the cheat in front of them. At this time, the chosen one in Eastern Europe had turned the more terrifying cheat into a woman who could warm his bed. Shang's mind was a little scattered. He couldn't help but think of Eastern Europe and the changes in Reki City. Reki City was changing. But the large mountainous area outside Reki City was still calm. It had just rained and the night sky was clear and bright, accompanied by the night light. Qin Weibai still stood there quietly, as silent as a statue. Many people had seen Qin Weibai, who was known as a goddess. She was as cold as an otherworldly being. She was arrogant and kept people 1,000 miles away. She was calm and indifferent, but there was a thunderous wisdom in silence. She was calm and composed when she wandered among the top figures in the dark world. She drove the whole Samsara palace to ride the wind and waves in the dark world. Li Tianlan had also seen Qin Weibai's charm and enchanting, which was unknown to outsiders. Only Flaming Fire and Lin Fengting had seen Qin Weibai's silence. When she was silent, she would stand or sit motionless, like a statue. She was not serious, but she gave people a very heavy feeling. It seemed that she was recalling something, thinking about something, and longing for something. At this time, Qin Weibai seemed to unconsciously take off all her clothes. In the moonlight, under the starry sky, she stood there with a kind of unbearable loneliness. It was an indescribable pale emotion that was difficult to describe. It carried the coldest loneliness and despair. Lin Fengting took the initiative to break the silence and said calmly, "We are here. If Jiang Qiansong comes, how likely is it that he will escape?" "I don't know. It depends on Jiang Qiansong's specific injury, but the biggest possibility is no more than 30%. Qin Weibai thought for a moment and said calmly, "Have you ever thought about what if he insists on not compromising?" Lin Fengting laughed. No one was willing to die. That was the truth. But if every Invincible Realm expert was really afraid of death, it was impossible for him to break through to the Invincible Realm. Jiang Qiansong was famous for his defense. The Jiang family of South America had developed technology and all kinds of strange defensive equipment. If Zhang Qiansong was unwilling to compromise and fought for the 20% to 30% chance, the possibility was not low. It may not be very likely that he will compromise with us, Qin Weibai said, but I prepared a fig leaf for him today. She looked down the mountain. At 7:45 p.m. in Wulan State, Eastern Europe, a white figure slowly came to the secret base of the Jiang family of South America in Eastern Europe. Qin Weibai saw him. He also saw Qin Weibai. Lin Fengting looked at the figure at the foot of the mountain and raised his eyebrows in surprise. Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State? Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State, Gong Sun Qi. As the representative of the neutral forces of Zhongzhou State, there were too many possibilities for the Jiang family of South America to compromise and cooperate with Gong Sun Qi, both now and in the future. Lin Fengting was deep in thought. At the same time, Zhongzhou State, Linton. His Majesty looked at Shang in front of him and said calmly, as for the last one to pay attention to, it is Gong Sun III. Gong Sun III? Shang looked blank. Hearing the surname Gong Sun, the first thing he thought of was Gong Sun Qi. But among the four spirits, Gong Sun Qi's strength was definitely the eldest. On the contrary, Shang was absolutely right to be the third. Gong Sun III? If it wasn't Gong Sun Qi, who was it? I'm used to calling him that. His Majesty laughed at himself and said lightly, it's Gong Sun Qi. The hillside was not high. Gong Sun Qi, dressed in white and hiding all the opportunities, soon walked to the top of the hillside. Qin Weibai took the initiative to reach out her hand. Gong Sun Qi had a strange look on his face, even a little flattered. Everyone in the dark world knew that the goddess never shook hands with anyone. Tonight, what was going on? Hello, Boss Qin. Gong Sun Qi held Qin Weibai's palm, but he didn't dare to hold it for too long. Things were a little abnormal, so he was even a little vigilant. Boss Qin, why did you ask me to come here tonight? There is indeed one thing. Qin Weibai said softly. Just say it. Gong Sun Qi nodded and looked at Lin Fengting with a calm expression. It's just a small matter. I hope you can talk to Zhang Qiansong on behalf of Zhongzhou State tonight. Qin Weibai said quietly. Gong Sun Qi smiled with some playfulness. Zhang Qiansong? He didn't think about the cause and effect because Qin Weibai would always explain it. So his question was very straightforward, very straightforward. What's in it for me? Qin Weibai hesitated, bowed slightly and said softly, Third uncle, please help me. Third uncle. Gong Sun Qi slowly turned around and looked at Qin Weibai. His eyes became extremely deep in an instant. Chapter 447. In Eastern Europe, the famous sword sharpness basically meant invincible sharpness. Qin Shilai, the dark sword master of Eastern Europe, rarely left Eastern Europe. Before the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, Eastern Europe was calm. So almost no one had seen Qin Shilai fight. Even when the Qin clan was in trouble, it was often the Polar Ground Alliance that they supported to solve the problem. The reason why Qin Shilai was ranked first on the holy list was mostly because he had challenged the Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong 3 times and escaped unscathed. Only a few people knew that this ranking was inflated. This year's ranking on the divine list was inflated. Li Tianlan, who ranked 9th, directly squeezed Qin Shilai, who should have entered the 15th place on the divine list, to the holy list. But even if Qin Shilai was ranked at the bottom of the divine list, it was still not his strength. Jiang Qiansong was sure of this. The Jiang family of South America had cooperated with Rekvia for a long time. Rekvia's main competitors in Eastern Europe were the other 3 families in Eastern Europe. So the Jiang family of South America had a lot of information about the other 3 families in Eastern Europe. This information was enough to convince Jiang Qiansong that Qin Shilai had long had the strength to enter the divine list. It was also because of this that Jiang Qiansong wanted to retreat. There was already a usurper in the Rekvia family, and the usurper turned to Li Tianlan. The Qin clan was also on Li Tianlan's side. Qin Shilai stood here with Li Tianlan with hundreds of elites of Xianyuan sword troop. Jiang Qiansong had to go. Although he felt that he still had a chance of winning in the current situation, the risk had gradually exceeded the possibility of victory. The shrill whistle pierced the night sky, and Jiang Qiansong became more and more anxious. He really couldn't give up Black Ghost. In the face of Qin Shilai's attack, Jiang Qiansong did not fight back at all and was completely focused on defense. His eyes were always fixed on the broken castle. There was a battle outside the castle. There was also a battle inside the castle. The entire castle looked extremely dilapidated, but it still looked like a huge monster entrenched in the mountainous area. But now this monster's body was shaking violently. The battle inside the castle spread from the inside to the outside. Large areas outside the castle were constantly collapsing, and smoke and dust were constantly filling the air, almost covering the night sky. Zhang Qiansong had no idea how intense the battle inside was. Should he advance or retreat? Zhang Qiansong began to hesitate like never before. He could feel that Black Ghost did not approach him in the whistle, but was getting farther and farther away from him. This showed that the current Black Ghost had completely lost control of the battle with Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan was suppressing Black Ghost? Zhang Qiansong felt that it was ridiculous, but he couldn't help but think about the consequences of this situation. Now his choice was actually very simple. Instead of retreating, he would temporarily get rid of Qin Shilai with the fastest speed and join Black Ghost. The combination of his absolute defense and Black Ghost's absolute attack was the greatest chance of winning tonight's battle. If the two of them didn't fight and joined hands to break out of the encirclement, it was almost certain that they would succeed. But he was not sure what state Black Ghost was under Li Tianlan's suppression. If Black Ghost was seriously injured, he would not advance but retreat. Instead, his last escape route might be blocked. He didn't want Black Ghost to die. But his own survival was the most important thing. Black Ghost was dead, Jiang Qinyan was dead. The Jiang family of South America would directly withdraw from the game in Eastern Europe, and the headquarters would be badly hurt. The consequences were dire. But in such a consequence, if he also died, the Jiang family of South America would not only be badly hurt, but also at the end of the road. Zhang Qiansong knew this very well. So when Black Ghost's battle was already a little bad, Zhang Qiansong didn't know whether he should persist or give up. The sharp sword light became more and more dazzling in front of him. The sword energy rose into the sky. The domain around Zhang Qiansong had been extremely deformed by the tearing. Zhang Qiansong, who was holding up the domain to deal with Qin Shilai's attack, took a step back subconsciously. This step was very small, but it was extremely subtle. As soon as his feet landed, Zhang Qiansong had noticed something wrong. It was an indescribable feeling. It seemed that at this moment even the surrounding air had solidified, and there was an indescribable danger in all directions. Zhang Qiansong suddenly looked up. The sword light disappeared in his sight. Qin Shilai's figure appeared in his eyes without any cover, extremely clear. It was not only Qin Shilai who was clear. All of a sudden, Zhang Qiansong found that the 100 elites of Xianyuan sword around him had become extremely clear. Their positions seemed to have moved, but they also seemed to have not moved. The minute change was completely concealed by the frozen silence. Perhaps it was just a single step, but it had already quietly formed an incomparably strange formation. At this moment, in front of the castle, every elite of Xianyuan sword troop was very clear. Qin Shilai stood in the middle, so clear that he was almost dazzling. Dark Sword Master. Super elite troops. The two sides seemed to be completely connected in an instant, forming a sword formation that could repel and tear everything apart. Zhang Qiansong stood in the center of the sword formation out of place. The sword of the Lin clan. The sword of the Li family. The sword of the Qin clan. They were of the same origin. This was the most fierce and overbearing sword intent in the Dark World. Surrounded by this kind of sword intent, Zhang Qiansong could only think of 4 words. Those who oppose me will die. The sharp sword began to rise slowly. In an instant, from all directions, all the forces of hundreds of elites of Xianyuan sword troop involuntarily gathered toward the sharp sword edge. The pressure, as majestic as the sea, roared and filled the world, pressed toward Zhang Qiansong, and finally gathered on the sharp sword edge. Qin Shilai's movements were getting slower and slower, as if he was bearing an unbearable weight. The huge force scattered and gathered, locking Zhang Qiansong in place. Zhang Qiansong could only take this sword strike head-on. It was not until now that he really understood Qin Shilai's plan. All the previous attacks were just to force him to adjust his position. Qin Shilai had never thought of fighting with him. All he wanted was this sword strike. One sword strike to decide the outcome. This was the standard style of the Lin clan. It was also the style of the Li family. Qin Shilai's face turned pale in the gathering of power. The sword formation of Xianyuan sword troop became more and more perfect. Double digits of thunder-shocking realm experts and dozens of experts at the peak of the fire-flaming realm formed a formation. with invincible realm experts as the core. Even Xianxia himself could not bear such a huge force. His figure gradually became illusory and transparent, but the surging power all over the sky continued to gather and turned into the sword intent that flowed wildly. The messy sword light gathered and boiled in Xianxia's hands, tearing the sky. In front of Zhang Qiansong, everything had completely disappeared, leaving only the sword light that kept flying in his eyes. The sword light rushed up to the sky and fell to the ground as if it were outlining something. Vaguely, an indifferent figure appeared in front of Zhang Qiansong as if it did not exist. The shadow was very vague and it was even difficult to form a complete outline. But the sword intent all over the sky was completely rioting with the appearance of this shadow. The sword intent flew as if it was tearing heaven and earth apart. It was an illusory shadow without any charm or even a silhouette. The shadow seemed to be holding a sword in its hand. Amidst the endless light, the sword was simply lifted up. It stabbed straight. It was a simple and slow movement. But at the moment when the sword shadow moved forward, all the sword light instantly gathered in the sword and the shadow. The long sword lit up instantly. The shadow also became clear for a moment. It was a slender, firm and incomparably sharp figure. Zhang Qiansong seemed to see a golden mask. All of a sudden, Zhang Qiansong felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. The clear shadow for less than half a second disappeared completely. Xianxia's figure appeared in front of Zhang Qiansong. Zhang Qiansong finally recognized this sword move, or the starting gesture of this sword move. The 15th blade, Samsara. This sword move started with the 15th blade. Samsara was the sword intent other than the 24 moves of sword. Under this sword move, all things turned to ashes. Chapter 448. This was the weirdest sword stroke that Zhang Qiansong had ever seen in his life. The 15th blade, Samsara, was the starting move. Everything turned to ashes. The strongest unique skill of the Qin clan. But this sword stroke had no charm, not even much essence. But the moment the sword stabbed forward, there was violent and unparalleled sword intent everywhere between heaven and earth. Under this sword stroke, Zhang Qiansong, who was ranked on the divine list and claimed to have the best defense in the world, sadly found that he could not stop this sword stroke without charm. This was truly an unstoppable sharpness that could cut through anything. Zhang Qiansong could not imagine how terrifying this sword stroke would be in its heyday. He had no time to think about it. The blade of sharpness was straight. It was too fast and too simple. The blade went straight into the night sky, bursting the space. In a trance, all the sword light disappeared completely. There was only a bright blade in front of Zhang Qiansong. The blade without any light or shadow pierced Zhang Qiansong's clothes. The next second, it was death. Zhang Qiansong's eyes widened. In an instant his hair stood on end, and a colorful halo exploded around him one after another. This was a power completely different from martial arts. It was the light of technology. In the Dark World, the Wang family of Beihai's gene potion technology was unrivaled and at the world's first-class level. And the individual combat equipment of the Jiang family of South America was also the most advanced in the Dark World. Zhang Qiansong was famous for his defense. In any case, he would carry no less than 10 pieces of defensive equipment. These pieces of equipment were inconspicuous. Maybe it was a ring, a bracelet, or a necklace. But at a critical moment, these pieces of equipment could become life-saving things after being triggered. Zhang Qiansong's body was surrounded by layers of hazy halos. The halo of light did not spread outwards. Instead, it tightly wrapped around Zhang Qiansong, looking like layers upon layers of protective shields. The sharpness went straight forward. Hundreds of elites of Xianyuan sword troop around became more and more solemn. Countless flames and thunderbolts turned into sword intent, gathered toward Xianxia, and finally disappeared without a trace. However, the silent sword qi on the sharp sword had completely torn apart the sky. The sword qi soared into the sky and swept across the sky and earth. The shield around Zhang Qiansong's body kept twisting and shaking. Colorful halos kept flying around him. Messy metal pieces kept exploding and flying out. The halos were broken layer by layer. The sharp sword qi became stronger and stronger. Vaguely, that blurry silhouette seemed to appear in front of Zhang Qiansong again. That figure seemed to completely overlap with Xianxia, with unparalleled sharpness and majesty. The power of over 100 super elites continued to gather. Xianxia stabbed forward with all his strength. Under this sword, Qin Shilai could only think of the simplest ending. Jiang Qiansong must die. Jiang Qiansong's eyes gradually became filled with despair. The ending he thought of was exactly the same as Qin Shilai's. Kacha. Just as the last layer of the shield was about to dissipate, a clear cracking sound suddenly rang out. Jiang Qiansong was stunned. Qin Shilai's face suddenly changed. His arms began to tremble slightly. The power from all directions was still converging towards him. His sword intent had reached an unprecedented peak. What he reincarnated was the sword intent of his ancestors. However, even though this sword intent had no charm, it was equally overbearing. At this time, the famous sword cutting edge, which was famous in Eastern Europe, could no longer bear the weight. A crack clearly appeared on the blade of cutting edge. In an instant, nearly half of the sword energy in the sky suddenly dissipated. Jiang Qiansong, who was ecstatic, suddenly roared. The moment the shield dissipated on his body, a strong light burst out from all over his body. The strong light filled the night sky and completely enveloped Qin Shilai. Qin Shilai's sword intent broke out completely. Hundreds of elites attacked at the same time. The raging fire and thunder that shook the sky burst out completely. At the same time, the strong light around Jiang Qiansong also burst out. The strong light was extremely messy, flying everywhere in a trance. 30-meter mortal world, dreamland of heaven. This was also a defensive move in the 30-meter mortal world. But its main function was to escape. The strong light obscured everyone's sight. Every flying light and shadow seemed to become Jiang Qiansong. The formation of hundreds of elites of Xianyuan swords suddenly became chaotic with the different targets of the attack. Jiang Qiansong, who had been waiting for this opportunity, ignored Black Ghost and turned away. The broken blade of cutting edge pierced into Jiang Qiansong's domain. The remaining sword energy rolled up wildly and spread wildly after breaking Jiang Qiansong's domain. But Jiang Qiansong had already rushed out of the encircled formation. At this moment he was only 30 meters away from the sword intent. But it was as far away as the end of the world. Jiang Qiansong suddenly burst out laughing. He stopped in place for a moment and looked back, his eyes extremely resentful. Qin Shilai's face was gloomy. He was a perfect person and a perfect formation. But it was just because of a few flaws in the sword that this destined to be earth-shattering attack failed. Qin Shilai's face turned red. However, such an arrangement had only left some minor injuries on Jiang Qiansong. If Jiang Qiansong managed to escape, the so-called Dark Swordmaster would truly lose all face. Boom! An extremely violent roar suddenly sounded in the distance. Before Jiang Qiansong had time to say anything, the entire remaining castle collapsed completely in an instant. The magnificent buildings standing on the mountainous area continued to collapse and shatter. The lights completely disappeared, and the bell tower in the castle collapsed in the night. Smoke and dust swept the night sky like a thick fog, and then disappeared in an instant. Or it should be said that it did not disappear. It was covered by darkness. A black tide of extreme darkness suddenly rushed out of the broken castle. The black tide smashed the entire castle with great fierceness, rushed up to the sky, blocked the moonlight and surged. The black tide had already lost its power, but it still carried a kind of mysterious charm. The black tide rushed through Qin Shilai and the sword formation formed by the troops of Xianyuan sword. As if by instinct, Qin Shilai raised the sword edge again. The remaining charm and the remaining sword energy merged into one in an instant. It was natural and perfect. The black tide and the sword light completely dissipated. In the blurred vision, the illusory figure suddenly became extremely clear. He raised the sword and stabbed forward. Qin Shilai disappeared. The black tide also disappeared. There was only the sword that was stabbing forward in the whole world. It occupied his vision, his consciousness, and the whole world. Jiang Qiansong let out the most miserable scream in his life. After all, he walked out of the sword formation and got rid of the lock. So in the face of this sword, he did not hesitate at all and turned to run. The incomparably grand sword energy filled the sky and moved forward slowly. The whole mountain area trembled under this sword intent. The sword intent swept through the castle and the mountains, and the condensed hillside burst into smoke and dust in an instant. Streaks of dust were flying wildly in the whole mountain area, like a sandstorm suddenly rising in a world of ice and snow. As the storm passed, the smoke and dust filled the sky and raged on everything. Zhang Qiansong opened his domain and defended with all his might. He ran away desperately and did not even dare to look back. This was equivalent to the joint attack of 2 generations of chosen ones after hundreds of years. But obviously neither of them was in a perfect state. The sword intent began to dissipate slowly. A woman's voice suddenly rang out in the midst of the blurry sandstorm. Damn it! With the voice, an incomparably terrifying force suddenly surged forward. The terrifying power created a whirlpool in the hazy sandstorm. The sword intent was getting fainter and fainter. The vortex of power trapped in the sandstorm suddenly flew out, forcibly squeezed back the vortex, which was getting smaller and smaller, and then exploded. Space and dust were flying all over the sky. A blurry space gradually returned to silence. Qin Shilai looked ahead with a gloomy face. Under the silent night sky, an incomparably enchanting and gorgeous figure stood there. She had blonde hair and was full of cold killing intent and fighting intent. But Zhang Qiansong had disappeared. Qin Shilai's face suddenly twisted for a moment, and then he finally recognized the woman in front of him. The corner of his mouth moved and he was about to speak. The woman in front of him had already clenched her fists and said in a cold tone, "Qin Shilai, how dare you attack me? You let Zhang Qiansong go." Qin Shilai suppressed the anger in his heart and his voice was solemn. "So what? I'm here tonight. Whoever I want to live can live and whoever I want to die must die." The woman's voice was arrogant and cold. She stared at Qin Shilai and said, "Do you want to live or die? What about you?" A hoarse voice suddenly sounded. It was a little weak but extremely calm. "Do you want to live or die?" The woman suddenly turned around. A young figure covered in blood slowly walked out of the ruins of the castle. His body was shaking slightly, but his eyes were as bright as stars, sharp and bright. The woman narrowed her eyes and looked at him. Suddenly she laughed. Li Tianlan? Li Tianlan, who barely walked out of the castle, ignored him. He came to Qin Shilai and asked directly, "Who is this?" Li Tianlan, who barely walked out of the castle, ignored him. He came to Qin Shilai and asked directly, "Who is this?" "King Tong, Queen of Shadows, Grand Duke of England." Qin Shilai's voice was hesitant. There were 3 women on the world divine list. 2 of them could be said to be on their side. But only King Tong was not. But it was King Tong who came tonight. And it was King Tong in her heyday. Li Tianlan said, "Oh," and looked at King Tong. "You let Zhang Qiansong go? So what?" King Tong looked at Li Tianlan playfully and said, "I can do whatever I like. What can you do?" She paused for a moment and suddenly laughed like a blooming flower. "I heard that you are with Yue Tong. Haven't you heard her say that? I'm her stepmother or godmother. Don't you call me auntie when you see me?" Li Tianlan looked at her calmly. After a long time he said blandly, "Bring Zhang Qiansong back and I won't make things difficult for you." "Are you talking to me?" King Tong tilted her head and chuckled. But her voice gradually turned cold. "Now get out of Reki City and Eastern Europe and I won't make things difficult for you. How about that? Just you." Li Tianlan seemed to smile. "Just because I am, kill." In King Tong's arrogant voice, Li Tianlan suddenly shouted. In an instant, falling stars turned into a big spear flowing with silver light in his hand. Li Tianlan took out a turquoise hairpin with his other hand. He inserted the hairpin directly into the body of the falling stars. The huge silver sniper rifle suddenly burst out a dangerous and illusory light. The incomparably bright light enveloped King Tong and locked her in an instant. Li Tianlan's palm was on the trigger. King Tong's body was stiff and she did not dare to move. She recognized that the gun in Li Tianlan's hand was a murderous weapon modified by the legend of Qin. She also recognized that the turquoise hairpin was Blue Sky Underworld. Both guns might be charging. But this madman was now using a murderous weapon as a bullet. He was going to destroy Blue Sky Underworld to kill her. Li Tianlan held the body of falling stars tightly. The huge body of the spear moved forward and nailed King Tong's forehead directly. Li Tianlan took a step forward expressionlessly, looked at King Tong and said calmly, "Kneel down." Chapter 449. Excluding the mountain shatterer that Tyrant used when the Polar Ground Alliance collapsed, tonight could be said to be the first time that a murderous weapon appeared on the battlefield of Eastern Europe. And there were 2 of them at the same time. Blue Sky Underworld. Falling stars. No one knew the characteristics of falling stars. But everyone knew that Blue Sky Underworld was still in the charging period. So Li Tianlan directly used Blue Sky Underworld as a bullet. The green hairpin disappeared in the huge silver gun. The hazy and mysterious silver light suddenly filled the sky and the earth. The silver falling stars began to tremble involuntarily. As long as Li Tianlan pulled the trigger, the youngest murderous weapon in the dark world would completely decompose Blue Sky Underworld in an instant, and then burst out an absolutely fatal power. The silver light shone in the night sky and turned into beams of light drifting between heaven and earth. Li Tianlan's power was great. The cold muzzle of the gun was pressed against King Tong's forehead, and the great force made King Tong's body completely lean back. Her perspective was completely tilted. In addition to the murderous weapon on her forehead, there was only the night sky, which looked vaguely beautiful in the silver light all over the sky in her sight. King Tong closed her eyes slightly and then opened them again. In an instant, the calmness in her golden eyes faded away, and they became extremely piercingly cold. Her leaning body straightened up little by little, and she stood in front of Li Tianlan with the murderous weapon on her forehead. Li Tianlan did not retreat. Under the two opposite forces, King Tong took a step back as a matter of course. But the silver muzzle was still fixed on her forehead. King Tong looked into Li Tianlan's eyes. Li Tianlan looked at her quietly. There was only an extremely pure emotion in his eyes. This kind of purity could be called calmness. It could also be interpreted as madness. You want me to get out of Wulan's state? Li Tianlan's tone was indifferent. The silver light burst out of his hand in an almost turbulent manner, covering the sky. The two murderous weapons began to gradually combine. Since there were murderous weapons in the dark world, no one had ever put a murderous weapon as a bullet in another murderous weapon. A murderous weapon was enough to protect a country. This was enough to deter an invincible realm expert. No one would be so extravagant. But just because no one had done it before didn't mean it was impossible. Murderous weapons were originally pure energy metals. If two murderous weapons were to combine and detonate together, the power would be unprecedented, and the consequences of doing so would undoubtedly be extremely serious. After this spear, Blue Sky Underworld was destined to disappear from the dark world. Falling stars would also be severely damaged, and the price to repair it would be extremely high. Such a huge price also represented the power of this spear. All murderous weapons would accumulate energy slowly over a long period of time. At this time, if Li Tianlan deliberately detonated Blue Sky Underworld at the cost of the complete destruction of Blue Sky Underworld, the power that erupted could even exceed that of the human emperor. Under such power, it was impossible for King Tong to escape. Li Tianlan held the silver spear with one hand and pointed at King Tong's forehead. His face gradually became a little ferocious. You want me to get out of Wulan's state? Who do you think you are? You let Jiang Qiansong go? Who do you think you are? King Tong's head kept shaking because of the spear. Her golden eyes became more and more demonic, and she stared at Li Tianlan. She was the queen of the Shadow Throne and had a supreme position in the entire European Union. The chaos in Eastern Europe was unanimously regarded by all the wealthy families in the Shadow Throne as the best opportunity for them to occupy Eastern Europe and annex the four families. King Tong was full of confidence on this trip. Eastern Europe and Western Europe. In the vast Europe, the entire dark world of Europe could be said to have been occupied by the Polar Ground Alliance and the Shadow Throne. The recent generations of leaders of the Polar Ground Alliance were not happy. This superpower jointly supported by the four families could be said to be the puppets of the four families. It was restrained by the four families above, countless wealthy families below, and the governments of Eastern Europe beside it. Therefore, the Polar Ground Alliance, which occupied Eastern Europe, was not free. The Shadow Throne was also not free. It was an institution very similar to the Polar Ground Alliance, but it was far more mature than the Polar Ground Alliance. The Shadow Throne was not a puppet in the hands of the super wealthy families and governments. It had successfully found its own position, a very high position in all classes in Western Europe, which was far more developed than Eastern Europe. But the Polar Ground Alliance was not a king. Prosperity often meant chaos. Western Europe, which was full of powerful countries, had always been at the center of the struggle in the Dark World. There were the Shadow Throne, the Vatican, the Dark Knights and Knights Templars. All the superpowers in the world had their own bases in Western Europe. Everyone even thought that the secret headquarters of the Samsara Palace was also in Western Europe. Everyone wanted to be the only one who was strong. But no one had enough power. So every force was waiting for an opportunity. In the chaos in Eastern Europe, the Polar Ground Alliance collapsed, Tyrant disappeared, and the four families lost the solid barrier in front of them. In the eyes of all the superpowers in the world, the whole of Eastern Europe had become a place where storms and opportunities were brewing. In everyone's mind, Eastern Europe meant different interests and status. In the Shadow Throne's mind, they would absorb everything left after the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance and assimilate all of Eastern Europe in the shortest time with the most similar operation mode. At that time, their power in Europe could even suppress the Vatican. This was what all the wealthy families in the Shadow Throne were looking forward to. Their queen, King Tong, was not at the top of the world divine list. But behind her throne was the full support of several developed countries and ancient wealthy families in Western Europe. What made King Tong more confident was their allies. He had used the full power of the murderous weapon Indefinite Grace, in exchange for an absolutely powerful ally. The Wang family of Beihai. The cooperation between the two could no longer be described as a simple alliance of the strong. Therefore, King Tong could not think of any reason for her failure. Perhaps the only thing she had not thought of was why the chaos in Eastern Europe had changed so quickly. The expected long stalemate did not occur. Zhou State used their youngest and sharpest young marshal to restart the Snowdance Corps. The young marshal and the army shocked the entire Dark World on the first day they arrived in Eastern Europe. The 5 Eastern European countries, the Jiang family of South America, and the Snowdance Corps were all involved in a chaotic battle in an instant. King Tong didn't even have time to prepare anything. But the foundation of the Shadow Throne was enough for her to kill her way to Wulan State alone. The current situation was chaotic. But King Tong was sure of one thing. No matter who won, the Jiang family of South America or the Snowdance Corps, the winner would not be easy. If she was fast enough, she'd become a paragon. She'd be strong enough to clean up the mess. No one tried to stop her. Even the Shadow Throne's most powerful ally this time was included. Wulan State might not be a big deal. But the 5 nearby countries centered on Wulan State were extremely sensitive. Controlling this place was basically equivalent to taking over 1/3 of Eastern Europe. With such huge benefits, King Tong could not hesitate at all. She came quickly, and the current scene was within her expectations. The Jiang family of South America failed. Qin Shilai was injured. Li Tianlan was seriously injured. Everything was in line with her expectations. But she did not expect that Li Tianlan had murderous weapons in his hands. And they were 2 murderous weapons. This meant that at this time, as long as Li Tianlan was ruthless enough, as long as he dared to destroy a murderous weapon, he didn't even need any combat capability. As long as he pulled the trigger, the Queen of the Shadow Throne would be turned into ashes in an instant. The feeling of death was so cold, with such a huge surprise and humiliation that King Tong's brain went blank again and again. Li Tianlan. King Tong gnashed her teeth, one word at a time. Her teeth were very white and the corners of her mouth were red. Even if she was extremely angry, she still had a very enchanting beauty. I'll repeat it again. Li Tianlan's tone was indifferent. Kneel down or I'll shoot you to death. His palm was steady and his voice was even more determined. Since you let Jiang Qianzong go, you can die for him. Do you dare? King Tong suddenly laughed. The humiliation in her heart was suppressed to the deepest part of her heart in an instant. She smiled calmly, which made her look even more beautiful. Li Tianlan's eyes suddenly flashed with an extremely dangerous sharpness. I'm Yuetong's stepmother. People like you don't care, do they? In the heart of people like you, for your hegemony, you don't even care about Yuetong, do you? King Tong's tone was calm. Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth and didn't speak, but his eyes obviously became colder. Yuetong can't stop you, King Tong said calmly. But what about Yuetong's father? Li Tianlan's pupils suddenly contracted, and his hand holding the murderous weapon suddenly tightened. Tianzong will show up here soon. He will represent Beihai and even Zhou State to discuss cooperation with Rothschild and the Shadow Throne. As for the content of the cooperation, Marshal Li is not qualified to know, but I can tell you that the content of our cooperation is how to use Wulan State to expand the influence of Zhou State and the Shadow Throne in Eastern Europe. Thank you for your fighting and contribution in Wulan State, Marshal Li. I'm willing to apologize for my inappropriate words before. King Tong smiled like a flower. Her smile was light and soft without any mockery, but it was extremely cold in Li Tianlan's ears. I think Rothschild and Beihai will never forget what Marshal Li has done in Wulan State in the future. I'm sorry and I'm very grateful. So now should I take this thing in your hand? Qin Shilai clearly heard every word of King Tong. His face gradually became serious. Wang Tianzong represented Zhongzhou State and Beihai to discuss with Rothschild how to use Wulan State. Li Tianlan was now the youngest highness in Zhongzhou State and had a high position and power. But in terms of weight, how could he compare with Wang Tianzong? At least Li Tianlan could represent the Snowdance Corps now. But in front of Wang Tianzong, in front of any invincible realm expert in Zhongzhou State, he could not represent Zhongzhou State. If Li Tianlan really withdrew from Wulan State under pressure, how should the relatives who were neighbors of the 5 Eastern European countries deal with themselves? Qin Shilai subconsciously glanced at Li Tianlan. He found that Li Tianlan was smiling. His smile was obviously undisguised and even his body was trembling. But he did not put down the gun pointing at King Tong, and his arm holding the gun was still stable. An indescribable shock and anger rose in Li Tianlan's heart, rushed straight to his mind and even occupied all his reason. When he was fighting for his life in Wulan State. When he was facing the whole international pressure in Wulan State. When he was fighting with the Jiang family of South America to the death in Wulan State. Zhongzhou State had been silent. Now the situation was gradually becoming clear. King Tong was coming. Wang Tianzong was also coming. He was going to discuss cooperation with King Tong in Wulan State on behalf of Zhongzhou State. Cooperation in Wulan State which he and the Snowdance Corps had conquered. *CK. Why? Since Marshal Li isn't tired, then raise your gun. But later, His Majesty the Sword Emperor may discuss the handover with you. I should probably avoid it. You think I will leave, don't you? Li Tianlan suddenly interrupted King Tong. King Tong's face froze for a moment and she looked at Li Tianlan. Just because he is the Sword Emperor, just because he can represent Zhongzhou State better than me? Li Tianlan's tone was soft and strange. So as long as he says something, I will give you Rekvia which I have conquered and Wulan State which I have conquered, right? I will get your thanks and then get out of Wulan State with your thanks. Do you think so? You? King Tong frowned. What? Li Tianlan was still smiling. This family, this city, this country, it was me and my army that fought for it. My army is still on the way. I can conquer Rekvia and my army can conquer the entire Wulan State. What can you and Wang Tianzong conquer? Every drop of blood and every life of me and the Snowdance Corps is not for your thanks. Do you think that Wang Tianzong can take away Wulan State by saying that he represents Zhongzhou State? Do you really think I'm dead? I can tell you now that I'm standing here. This place belongs to the Snowdance Corps, not to the Wang family of Beihai, nor to the Shadow Throne. As long as I'm alive, who can or can't let me leave Wulan State? Because you, King Tong, are not qualified. Wang Tianzong is not qualified either. From now on, this is a city controlled by the Snowdance Corps. As the queen of a foreign force, why do you think I dare not kill you? Wang Tianzong? King Tong's face suddenly changed. She took a step back subconsciously and opened her mouth. Shut up. Li Tianlan sneered. The falling stars moved and the cold muzzle, which was shining with silver light, retreated a little and directly stabbed into King Tong's mouth. The cold muzzle almost stabbed into King Tong's throat in an instant, blocking all her words. You can live a little longer. Li Tianlan said calmly. His Majesty the Sword Emperor is coming, right? I'll wait for him. King Tong's body trembled involuntarily. It was not until this moment that she was completely sure that the youngest marshal of Zhongzhou State was not only amazing in spirit. He was a complete lunatic. Li Tianlan held the gun and looked into the distance. A female voice came from afar. It was clear, soft and smiling. Your Highness is completely right. The sacrifice of the Snowdance Corps can't be replaced by a few words from some people. On behalf of the Vatican, Angel is willing to fully support Your Highness and Zhongzhou State in gaining a foothold in Eastern Europe. The voice was far away and sounded a little ethereal. But before he finished speaking, another voice sounded. The voice was very close and it sounded completely beside Li Tianlan. Whether Zhongzhou State can gain a foothold in Eastern Europe or not, when does it need the support of the Vatican? The clear and indifferent voice was neither fast nor slow, but it instantly covered the entire mountain top. Li Tianlan suddenly turned his head. Less than 10 meters away from him, the silent space fluctuated silently and almost imperceptibly for a moment. An ordinary figure slowly appeared beside Li Tianlan. He glanced at Li Tianlan and said quietly, "Do you think it's necessary?" Li Tianlan subconsciously tightened his body. And the group of people who had appeared on the mountainside in the distance also subconsciously paused. The atmosphere was still quiet. But the ruins of the entire castle suddenly became like facing a formidable enemy. Sword Emperor of Zhou State. Wang Tianzong. Li Tianlan held the gun and remained motionless. After a long time he nodded calmly. "Greetings, Your Majesty." His voice was flat, but he did not loosen his grip on the gun at all. The muzzle was still stuffed in King Tong's mouth. King Tong did not dare to speak. Wang Tianzong nodded and did not look at King Tong. He just looked down the mountain with Li Tianlan. After a pause, the people at the foot of the mountain finally came up. The leader was a woman in white with her face covered in a veil. She was graceful, dignified and holy. She slowly came to Li Tianlan, but ignored Wang Tianzong. She just bowed slightly to Li Tianlan and said with a soft smile, "I'm Angel from the Vatican. Greetings, Your Highness." "Why are you here, Holy Virgin?" Li Tianlan's tone was calm. "I just want to explain something to Your Highness." Because of Wang Tianzong's existence, Angel's words were simple and concise. She turned slightly, pointed to the gloomy chaos beside her and said softly, "Your Highness, this is His Highness Chaos, the head knight of Knights Templars. I have learned in detail about the raid on the Samsara Palace by Knights Templars and the Jiang family of South America. I can swear by my faith that in this matter, the Knights Templars have never slaughtered the garrison of Zhou State. All this has nothing to do with us. Of course, we have the sincerity to resolve this unpleasant misunderstanding, and we will express our apologies at the appropriate time." Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes and looked at Chaos. Chaos's face changed for a while. Under Angel's gaze he finally took a slow step forward, bowed deeply to Li Tianlan and said in a dry voice, "Please forgive me, Your Highness." Divine Emperor of Nine Heavens. Chapter 450. In front of His Majesty, Chaos asked Your Highness to forgive him. With just one action, the Vatican's position had been completely clearly expressed. This should have been a matter of a lot of persuasion. But Wang Tianzong came quickly. So on such an occasion, it became a matter of a few words. Li Tianlan was not a fool. Neither was Wang Tianzong. No one was a fool. So the people present instantly understood what the entire Vatican was trying to express. Wang Tianzong slowly narrowed his eyes, still looking calm. Li Tianlan was thoughtful. He looked at Chaos, who had almost bent to the ground in front of him, and remained calm. Jiang Qianyan. Black Devil. Chaos. 3 experts on the holy list. In one day 2 of them lay dead in front of him and 1 bowed his head in front of him. This action represented not only the position of the Vatican, but also Li Tianlan's future interests. In fact, just a bow from Chaos in front of him was enough to boost his prestige. Chaos was the chief knight of Knights Templars. And Knights Templars was the spokesman of the Vatican in the dark world. It was self-evident how noble Chaos's identity was. Li Tianlan didn't speak, just glanced at Angel slightly. Angel stood there quietly, the night breeze blowing. Looking at the white veil on her body, the saintess behind the white veil seemed to smile. Knights Templars and the Vatican can jointly issue a life statement, emphasizing our friendly relationship with the Snowdance Corps, Zhou State and Arctic Ocean Command. Knights Templars can apologize to Zhou State. Your Highness, I can assure you on behalf of the Vatican that as long as you are still in Eastern Europe, the Vatican and Knights Templars will be your most reliable friends. Li Tianlan didn't care about friends. He didn't even care if the other party was reliable. Because everyone knew that it was nonsense. What he cared about was the huge impact that the Snowdance Corps and the Vatican would bring in a short period of time. Wulan State was extremely important to him. If he could control the 5 Eastern European countries around Wulan State, he would almost control nearly 1/3 of the power in Eastern Europe. Such an achievement meant too many things in Zhou State. Eastern Europe was huge. So when Eastern Europe was in chaos, everyone wanted a piece of the pie. But there were not many madmen who had to take down all of Eastern Europe. With the 5 Eastern European countries near Wulan State, Li Tianlan was equivalent to controlling a bridge from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. To this extent, Zhou State could be said to be one of the winners of the chaos in Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan would be much more relaxed next. He could attack and defend at will. With such an advantage, he would never retreat just because of Wang Tianzong's so-called gratitude. But not retreating required strength. The Bayou country's Qing clan was considered a force. If they could form an alliance with the Vatican, it would also be a form of strength. This could be said to be the sincerity of the Vatican. However, no sincerity could be given unconditionally. Li Tianlan admitted that he, a young man who had not entered the invincible realm, could not afford a bow from the chief knight of Knights Templars. If the church gave a lot, they would definitely take a lot as well. But that was not the most important thing. What mattered was that he had something to talk about with the Vatican. Qin Shilai pulled Li Tianlan's sleeve quietly. Wang Tianzong was here. King Tong was here. Angel is here. They were all familiar faces. Qin Shilai felt really embarrassed standing here. Li Tianlan nodded slightly, looked at Chaos and said calmly, Knights Templars and the Jiang family of South America jointly raided the garrison base of Zhongzhou State. Forgiveness. How can I forgive him? He was now the marshal of Zhongzhou State. So he could not mention the Samsara Palace on the surface. Chaos bent over, did not get up and did not respond. The deputy commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps who came with me has gone to track down Jiang Qiansong. If there is a chance, the deputy commander of Melad will kill Jiang Qiansong. This is the sincerity of the Vatican and Knights Templars. Angel said calmly and elegantly. Li Tianlan smiled and was silent for a long time. Chaos still maintained the bowing posture that was a little humiliating for him, as if he had become a statue. Get up. After a long time, Li Tianlan said slowly. During the whole process he did not look at Wang Tianzong, nor did he ask for the opinion of the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State. Thank you for your forgiveness, Your Highness. Angel smiled softly. As the veil fluttered, she looked peerless. Wang Tianzong looked around, his eyes paused on King Tong, and then he suddenly laughed. Tianlan, when can you represent Zhongzhou State? Wang Tianzong asked softly. Li Tianlan glanced at him and said, If I remember correctly, His Majesty recommended me to lead the army to the north. At the end of the meeting I could represent Zhongzhou State. Wang Tianzong nodded and said, You can indeed deal with some things on behalf of Zhongzhou State. But it doesn't mean that you can handle everything. The relationship between Zhongzhou State and the Vatican is related to national policy. It's not just a matter of Eastern Europe. How can it be decided by you? Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes and looked at Wang Tianzong. His voice was soft and gentle, and he said lightly, I will report this matter to the Hidden Dragon Sea and the Decision-Making Committee. I think they will agree with my way of dealing with it. You don't have to worry about it, Your Majesty. Wang Tianzong was silent for a moment. His eyes were as deep as the sea in an instant. Li Tianlan looked at him quietly. An undetectable pressure kept shrouding him. Li Tianlan's expression was calm, but the sweat on his back was getting more and more. It seeped into the wound and stung. After a long time, Wang Tianzong opened his mouth lightly. His voice was still unhurried, and it seemed to be the same as before. But Li Tianlan was keenly aware that there was something more in his tone. There was a little more factor that he couldn't capture at the moment. They may agree. Zhongzhou State may agree. Wang Tianzong said indifferently, but, he paused and said, I don't agree. In an instant, everyone's heart sank. Wang Tianzong was the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State and was qualified to call himself I. But in the past many years he rarely used this word. Only a few people knew that every time he used this word his emotions had surged to a certain extent. Or anger or emotion or self-mockery or something else. But when this word came out of his mouth, it only represented one emotion. That was determination. Li Tianlan finally realized what the subtle thing in Wang Tianzong's tone that he couldn't capture was. That was majesty. The real, superior and irresistible majesty. This feeling was very faint, but when it surged, it was like a completely surging and roaring deep sea with a kind of power to destroy everything. Wang Tianzong's eyes fell on Chaos. Chaos had stood up. But in an instant he couldn't look directly at Wang Tianzong's eyes. It was calm all around, the night was deep, the moonlight was cold and the stars were lonely. Chaos's body began to tremble for no reason. He was the knight with the strongest faith in the Vatican. That was why he became the chief knight of Knights Templars. He was an invincible realm expert at the top of the holy list. That was why he became the spokesman of the Vatican in the dark world. But at this moment, the boundless coldness suddenly fell on him as Wang Tianzong's eyes fell on him. He didn't know what happened, but he instinctively felt fear. Fear became his only emotion. It's a fact that we joined hands with the Jiang family of South America to attack the garrison of Zhou state. Facts can't be changed by any statement, nor can sincerity make up for it. Wang Tianzong said lightly, a sin is a sin. Zhou state can forgive it. Marshal Li can forgive it. But I won't forgive it. The moonlight all over the sky seemed to dim for a moment. The light converged to the sky. But the cold moon in the sky was getting brighter. Light and darkness seemed to alternate for a moment. A breeze blew in front of Wang Tianzong. The breeze came from afar and fell from a high place. It blew over the dust of the ruins, the dry grass, the night sky and chaos. It was silent. Chaos's body suddenly stiffened in place. He stared at Wang Tianzong. There was only fear left in his eyes. Wang Tianzong's eyes were calm and indifferent. The wind was a little stronger with a chill that could penetrate into the bone marrow. In everyone's sight, Chaos's body began to disintegrate silently. Clothes, weapons, armor, flesh, internal organs and bones. They all collapsed into ashes. The dust in the sky was blown away by the wind. Chaos disappeared. There was no blood in the field, no sword intent fluctuation, and even the hay under Chaos's feet was intact. It was as if he had never been here before. He turned into dust and disappeared from the world without a trace. Xianxia's face changed dramatically. Angel's body was completely stiff and she opened her mouth subconsciously. You, puff. A mouthful of blood flowed out of her mouth as she spoke, dyeing the white gauze red. Several saint warriors who followed her took a step forward in rage. There seemed to be nothing in the air. However, the bodies of several warriors seemed to have collided with countless swords and knives. Their flesh and blood were scattered all over the sky. Before they fell to the ground, they had been blown into ashes by the breeze. Are you familiar with it? Wang Tianzong suddenly glanced at Xianxia and asked. Xianxia's eyes were bitter, but he could not speak. The sword intent that filled heaven and earth silently enveloped the entire mountain area. Xianxia could not speak now or even blink. In this state, as long as he opened his mouth, he would be seriously injured by the sword intent. If he moved rashly, he would end up like the warriors just now. All things turned to ashes. This was almost close to the peak state of all things turned to ashes. Only Li Tianlan could not feel the sword intent around him. Wang Tianzong's sword intent completely bypassed Li Tianlan and did not bring him the slightest threat. It was not because he was powerful. It was because he was the marshal of the Snowdance Corps of Zhou state. Li Tianlan held falling stars in his palm, and the muzzle that was directly inserted into King Tong's mouth kept moving forward. He looked at Wang Tianzong with indifference in his eyes. Put down the gun. Wang Tianzong said slowly, we'll discuss the matter of Wulan state later. But I want to take King Tong away. Li Tianlan took a deep breath, suppressed the restlessness in his heart and said calmly, why? Zhou state and Rothschild have always had a lot of cooperation. Cooperating with Rothschild to occupy Wulan state is the best result for Zhou state, unless you want to be like what happened more than 20 years ago, when all the Western European countries joined hands, and the Li family at its peak had to compromise. Do you think you can go against the natural order? Wang Tianzong looked at Li Tianlan and said in a concise tone, let her go. But Li Tianlan's tone was so calm that it was almost numb. There was no fluctuation in his voice, although his heart was surging to the extreme. Zhou state has cooperation with Rothschild. But it doesn't mean that Rothschild and the Shadow Throne can threaten the marshal of Zhou state. Li Tianlan suddenly laughed. His eyes were shining and the light was flowing, full of determination. I'll borrow a word from your majesty just now. Now that King Tong is in my hands, I don't want to let her go, so even if the whole Zhou state agrees that you can take her away. But I don't agree. His hand that was holding the gun became extremely stable in an instant. As King Tong's eyes suddenly widened, he gently pressed his finger down and pulled the trigger in an instant. The trigger fell a little. But there was no gunshot. All the power was concentrated on Li Tianlan's finger. But the trigger that fell a little couldn't be pulled no matter what. The silver light all over the sky was flashing and rioting, but the silent sword intent completely isolated the silver light. The silver light was shining, but it couldn't be concentrated. The all-encompassing sword intent almost froze all Li Tianlan's movements in an instant. Wang Tianzong slowly moved forward and held the muzzle of falling stars. He pulled the muzzle out of King Tong's mouth little by little. Li Tianlong didn't move. He couldn't even move a finger. Wang Tianzong touched King Tong's hair and took her hand. He looked at Li Tianlong and said calmly, "You have the right and qualification to disagree. But I'm here and I forbid you to shoot." "How can you shoot?"